Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never told this story outside of my family. It happened back in August of 1963, and honestly, I'm still trying to make sense of it almost 60 years later. I was 13 years old that summer, spending weekends at my Uncle Ray's cabin in Dickinson County, Michigan. It was this little two-bedroom place tucked away in the woods. Nothing fancy, but to a kid from the suburbs, it felt like wilderness paradise. That Friday started like any other weekend at the cabin. My parents had dropped me off Thursday night before heading to Chicago for some work thing of my dad's. I remember it had been raining all morning, not a downpour, just this steady drizzle that kept us cooped up inside. Uncle Ray spent most of the day tinkering with his fishing reels while Aunt Martha baked cookies, and I flipped through old hunting magazines. By late afternoon, the rain finally let up. The woods had that clean, earthy smell that comes after rainfall. Everything was still dripping, but you could tell the weather was clearing. Uncle Ray's German Shepherd Duke had been antsy all day, pacing between windows and whining to go outside. Duke was always my buddy during these trips, usually stuck to me like glue whenever we explored the woods. Around 5 or so, Aunt Martha went out back to shake out some rugs she'd washed earlier. The backyard wasn't much, just a small clearing that gave way to dense pine forest about 50 feet from the cabin. I remember I was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing pictures of deer and imagining I'd see one when Uncle Ray took me hunting in the fall. I'll never forget the sound of the screen door slamming open and Aunt Martha's voice. She came running in, face white as paper, saying there was a bear in the yard. Her voice had this trembling quality I'd never heard before. "Ray, there's a bear out there, a big one." Uncle Ray moved faster than I'd ever seen him move before. He didn't even ask questions, just went straight for his rifle mounted above the fireplace. "Stay inside," he told me firmly as he checked the chamber. Now, I've always been the curious type. Some might call it foolish, especially considering what happened next, but I couldn't help myself. While Uncle Ray was loading his rifle, I slipped over to the back window for a peek. What I saw through that smudgy glass made my stomach drop. It wasn't a bear, not even close. Standing under a big pine tree about 75 feet from our cabin was something I couldn't explain. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, 8 feet at least, maybe more. It was covered in short brown hair. Not shaggy like a bear, but more uniform. The thing that really got me, though, was how it was standing, completely upright, with its right arm casually draped over a tree branch, like someone waiting for a bus. I don't know what came over me. Before Uncle Ray could stop me, I was out the back door. I needed to see this thing clearly, needed to know I wasn't imagining it. The creature turned its head toward me as I stepped onto the wet grass. That's when I got a good look at its face. It wasn't a bear's face or any animal I recognized. It looked almost human, but not quite. The face was flatter, with a pronounced brow ridge. Its eyes were dark, deep set. There was an intelligence there that made my skin crawl. For what felt like forever, we just looked at each other. It didn't make any threatening moves, didn't bare teeth, just watched me with those dark eyes. I took a few steps forward, drawn by some mixture of curiosity and disbelief. I heard the screen door creak behind me as Uncle Ray stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. That sound seemed to break whatever strange moment was happening between me and the creature. It turned away from me, unhurried, and simply walked away up a deer path into the woods. Not running, not crashing through underbrush like a panicked animal, just walking deliberately, its long arms swinging slightly at its sides. "Jason, get back here right now!" Uncle Ray's voice finally broke through my trance. I stumbled backward toward the cabin, eyes still fixed on the spot where the creature had disappeared into the trees. That wasn't a bear, was all I could say when I reached him. My voice sounded strange, like it was coming from somewhere else. Uncle Ray had this look on his face, part confusion, part fear, but trying hard to hide both. "Let's take a look," he said, gripping his rifle tightly. We walked to where it had been standing. The ground was soft from the rain, covered in pine needles. There were scuff marks where it had stood, but no clear footprints. I remember feeling disappointed by that. Like without tracks, I couldn't prove what I'd seen. "How big did it look to you?" Uncle Ray asked, his voice quieter than usual. 8 feet at least, covered in brown hair, but it had a face almost like a person. He nodded slowly, eyes scanning the woods. I only caught a glimpse before it walked away. Didn't look like any bear I've ever seen. When we went back inside, that's when I noticed Duke. This dog, who normally bounded through the woods fearlessly, was wedged between the couch and the wall, trembling. No amount of coaxing would get him to come out. Even when Aunt Martha put his food bowl down, he wouldn't budge from his hiding spot. That night, nobody talked much during dinner. Aunt Martha kept saying it must have been a bear, just a strange-looking one. Uncle Ray didn't contradict her, but I could tell by the way he kept glancing out the windows that he wasn't convinced. I know what I saw wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright that long. They don't have that kind of face. They don't walk away on 2 legs like they're taking a stroll. I hardly slept that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside had me wide awake, imagining those dark eyes peering in through my window. Duke slept, pressed against my bedroom door. Not inside with me like usual, but guarding the entrance. Even in his fear, he was protecting us. The next morning, Uncle Ray and I went back to the spot. In the daylight, with the ground dried somewhat, there was even less to see, just some disturbed pine needles and dirt. Uncle Ray did find a broken branch about 7 feet up, snapped in a way that seemed deliberate, not weather damaged. "Could have been anything," he muttered, but I could tell he didn't believe that. For the rest of that weekend, Duke refused to go into the woods. This dog, who lived for forest adventures, wouldn't set foot past the yard. He'd stand at the edge of the trees, hackles raised, and whine until we turned back. We kept coming to the cabin on weekends that summer and into fall, but things felt different. Uncle Ray started bringing his hunting buddies more often. We never went into the woods alone anymore. Nobody ever said why out loud. Sometimes at night I'd hear Duke growling at the window, staring into the darkness at something none of us could see. Uncle Ray would grab his rifle and check outside, but he never found anything. Once or twice I thought I heard heavy footsteps circling the cabin late at night, but when I told Uncle Ray, he said it was probably just deer. I didn't believe him. Deer don't make the floorboards vibrate when they walk. About a month after the sighting, we found a pile of rocks stacked in a neat tower about 100 yards from the cabin. Not a natural formation. Someone or something had deliberately placed them that way. Uncle Ray kicked it over and said some kids must have been playing in the woods, but there weren't any other cabins for miles, and I never saw any other kids around there. As fall turned to winter, the incidents became less frequent. Duke still wouldn't go into certain parts of the woods, but he seemed less on edge overall. By the next summer, things had almost returned to normal, except for Duke. That dog never again walked the forest trails he once loved. He'd go into the yard, but the woods were off limits in his mind. Uncle Ray kept that cabin until the mid-70s before finally selling it. I asked him once, years later, what he thought we'd seen that day. We were sitting on his porch in town, both of us much older. Duke had been gone for years by then. "Don't know for sure," he said, taking a long sip of his coffee, "but I know it wasn't a bear." That was as close as he ever came to admitting what we both knew. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years. Some match what I saw, others don't. I've never gone public with my story because, honestly, what's the point? Without evidence, I'm just another crazy person claiming to have seen something impossible. But I know what I saw standing under that pine tree in 1963. I know how it looked at me with those dark, intelligent eyes. I know how it affected Duke, how a brave dog became afraid of the woods he loved. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching cabins from the edge of clearings, occasionally stacking rocks or breaking branches. I wonder if it remembers the 13-year-old boy who walked toward it instead of running away. I'm an old man now, and I've never seen anything like it again. But to this day, when I'm in the woods and feel like I'm being watched, I look for a tall figure with its arm draped over a branch. And I still can't bring myself to hike alone. Story 2. I'm still shaking a bit typing this out, even though it happened all the way back in early August 2002. My friend Eric and I had been planning this backpacking trip to the Selkirk Mountains in Idaho for months. We weren't newbies. Between us, we had probably 20 years of wilderness experience. I'd hiked all over the Pacific Northwest, had run into black bears, even had a close call with a mountain lion once. Nothing had ever rattled me like what happened at that alpine lake. We'd picked a spot that was pretty remote. You had to follow these old, overgrown logging roads for about an hour, then hike another 3 hours through some really dense forest and up some steep ridges. The plan was simple. 4 days of fishing, camping, and just disconnecting from everything. The kind of trip we'd done dozens of times before. The first day went exactly as planned. We reached the lake around mid-afternoon, found this perfect little clearing about 50 yards from the water, and set up our tent. We gathered firewood, filtered some water, and caught a couple small trout for dinner. That night, we sat around the campfire, had a couple beers we'd packed in, worth the extra weight for that first night, and just enjoyed the absolute quiet. You know that feeling when you're so far from civilization that the silence has its own presence? That's what it was like. I remember thinking how perfect it all was. The second day started off great too. We woke up with the sun, had a quick breakfast, and grabbed our fishing gear to try the far side of the lake, where we'd spotted some promising spots the evening before. The weather was perfect, not too hot, clear blue skies, just a light breeze. We'd been fishing for maybe 3 hours when we heard it. I was just casting my line out when this sound echoed across the lake. It's so hard to describe, but it was like a scream. Not human, though. It was too deep, too powerful. It started low and then rose in pitch before tapering off. It lasted maybe 5 or 6 seconds. I immediately looked at Eric, and I could tell from his face he'd heard it too. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, like he was afraid of being heard. "I don't know. Maybe an elk," I said, but I knew it wasn't an elk. I'd heard elk bugle plenty of times. This was different. It came from the ridge behind us, maybe half a mile away. We tried to laugh it off, but neither of us cast another line. We just stood there, scanning the tree line, waiting. About 10 minutes later, it came again. The same sound, but louder, closer. This time, there was no mistaking it. Whatever made that noise was moving toward us. "Let's head back to camp," Eric said, already reeling in his line. I nodded and started packing up my gear. The whole time, we kept looking over our shoulders, staring into the woods. The forest suddenly felt different, threatening somehow. We were about 100 yards from our campsite when we heard it a third time. This one was more of a roar than a scream, and it was coming from the slope directly above our tent. My heart was hammering in my chest. Whatever this thing was, it was now between us and the trail back to the car. We made it back to camp and just sat there, barely talking. We didn't light a fire, just ate some trail mix and jerky. The sun was starting to set, and neither of us wanted to be outside when darkness fell. We crawled into the tent before it was fully dark and turned off our headlamps. We didn't want to draw attention to ourselves. I don't think either of us expected to sleep, but eventually exhaustion took over. I'm not sure how long I was out when the footsteps woke me up. Thud, 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 slow, heavy steps. Maybe 30 or 40 feet from the tent. I froze, my eyes shot open in the darkness, and I could feel Eric tensing up beside me. He was awake too. These weren't the footsteps of a deer or elk moving through the underbrush. They were too deliberate, too heavy, and most importantly, they were bipedal. 2 legs, not 4. Each step sent a small vibration through the ground that I could feel through my sleeping pad. The footsteps slowly circled our tent. They'd move a few paces, stop for maybe 30 seconds, then move again. It was methodical, like whatever it was studying us. I was barely breathing, afraid that the slightest sound would provoke it. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 minutes, the footsteps stopped. I thought maybe it had left, but then it happened, a scream that made the earlier ones seem like whispers. It was so close, maybe 20 yards away, and so powerful that I could feel it in my chest. It wasn't just loud, it was physically forceful. I've never experienced anything like it before or since. Eric and I both reached for our defenses at the same time. I had my hunting knife in a death grip, and he had his bear spray ready. We hadn't said a word to each other, but we both knew the situation was dire. The footsteps started again, coming closer to the tent. Then there was this loud crack, the unmistakable sound of a thick branch being snapped in half. It wasn't broken by stepping on it. Whatever this thing was, it had picked up a branch and deliberately broken it, like it was sending us a message. And then came the breathing. It was standing right outside our tent, maybe 3 or 4 feet from where I was lying. I could hear these long, wet-sounding exhalations, slow and controlled. In, out, in, out. Each breath seemed to last forever. The sound was so close that if I had reached out and pressed my hand against the tent wall, I felt like I would have touched whatever was on the other side. This continued for about 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. I was shaking uncontrollably by this point, my knife still clutched in my hand, though I knew it would be useless if the thing decided to come into the tent. Finally, the heavy footsteps began to move away, slowly at first, then faster, until the sound faded into the forest. Even after we couldn't hear it anymore, neither of us moved or spoke for at least an hour. Eventually, Eric whispered, "What the fuck was that?" I had no answer. We stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting back to back in the tent, watching opposite sides in case it came back. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? When the first hint of dawn appeared, we cautiously unzipped the tent and looked outside. The forest looked normal, peaceful even, but it felt wrong. We immediately checked around the tent and found areas where the grass was completely crushed flat about 20 feet away. There were broken sticks and disturbed earth, but no distinct footprints in the rocky soil. We packed up camp in record time. We didn't even bother with breakfast, just stuffed everything into our packs and got the hell out of there. The hike back was the most terrifying part. The entire forest was dead quiet, no birds singing, no squirrels chattering, nothing. It was like everything was holding its breath. That unnatural silence followed us for almost the entire hike out. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had us spinning around, expecting to see something massive charging through the trees. We made it back to the car in about half the time it had taken us to hike in, practically jogging the last mile. Once we got back to civilization, Eric and I tried to rationalize what had happened. We're both practical guys, not prone to exaggeration or flights of fancy. We've encountered bears, moose, cougars, all the usual suspects in North American wilderness. But nothing has ever behaved like what we experienced that night. The deliberate nature of it all is what still haunts me. The way it announced itself from a distance, then moved closer. The way it circled our tent. The breaking of the branch, the breathing. It wasn't just some animal stumbling upon our camp. It felt calculated, intelligent, like it was sending us a message. This is my territory. You are not welcome here. I've never gone back to that lake, and neither has Eric. We still go camping and hiking, but never in that part of Idaho. Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I catch myself listening for that scream or those heavy footsteps. I've spent countless hours researching what it might have been. The only explanation that seems to fit all the details is something I would have laughed at before that trip. A Sasquatch. I know how that sounds. Before this happened, I would have been the first to roll my eyes at Bigfoot stories. But I know what I heard and felt that night. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't any recognized animal that inhabits those mountains. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I wish I could convince myself it was just a bear, or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I know that something was out there, something that wanted us gone, something that could have hurt us but chose to intimidate us instead. It's been over 20 years now, and I still wake up sometimes with my heart racing, convinced I can hear those slow, heavy footsteps circling my house, or that wet breathing just outside my window. The rational part of my brain knows it's just the wind or the house settling, but another part of me, the part that spent that night in the Selkirks, isn't so sure. Whatever was out there that night changed how I see the wilderness forever. There are things in the deep woods that defy explanation, things that most people will go their whole lives without encountering. And honestly, they're the lucky ones. Story 3. My girlfriend Kim and I have been going up to my family's summer house in Dakina for years now. It's this small vacation town where my grandparents bought a place back in the 70s. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom cabin about half a mile from the water, but it's peaceful and has all these memories attached to it. Every July we drive up there for 2 weeks of fishing, hiking and camping. It's our tradition. Last summer started like any other trip. We arrived on a Saturday afternoon, unpacked the car, aired out the musty rooms, and made our usual grocery list. The cabin had been empty since my parents visited in May, so there were cobwebs to clear and dust everywhere. Nothing unusual. The next morning we headed to the northern store. It's this general store that's been there forever, sells everything from fishing lures to canned beans. We needed supplies for our 3-day camping trip to Stinger Lake, which is about an hour boat ride from the main lake. We've camped there at least 5 times before. It's secluded, the fishing is incredible, and there's this perfect little clearing about 30 feet from the shore where we always set up. I was grabbing some fishing line when I bumped into Earl, one of my grandfather's old fishing buddies. Must be pushing 80 now, but still comes up every summer. We got to talking, and when I mentioned we were heading to Stinger Lake, his whole demeanor changed. "You sure about that?" he asked, lowering his voice. "Been some strange things happening out that way." I figured he meant bears, or maybe some rowdy teens, but then he told me about his friend Dave, who'd been fishing out near the narrows that lead to Stinger. According to Earl, Dave had seen something walking on 2 legs along the shoreline at dusk. Something big. Said it wasn't a bear. It was moving wrong. More like a person, but way too tall and covered in dark hair. "Dave's not the type to make stuff up," Earl said. "Been hunting these woods for 60 years and never seen anything like it. Said it was a Sasquatch, plain as day." I laughed it off, of course. Told him we'd keep an eye out. Kim rolled her eyes when I told her about it in the truck. "Your grandpa's friends and their stories," she said. We joked about it while loading up the boat. Our aluminum fishing boat with the 25 horsepower motor that's probably older than I am. We set off around noon. The weather was perfect. Sunny, about 75 degrees, with just enough breeze to keep the bugs away. The boat ride through the Narrows is always gorgeous, all pine trees and rocky outcroppings. We reached Stinger Lake around 1 o'clock and headed straight for our usual spot. The first weird thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Usually, there's birds everywhere, sometimes a beaver slapping its tail on the water. But that day, nothing. Just the sound of our motor echoing off the trees. I didn't mention it to Kim, but it put me on edge. We pulled up to the shore and started unloading. Our campsite was just like we remembered. Flat clearing surrounded by pine and birch trees with easy access to the water. But as we were setting up the tent, Kim pointed out something odd. A massive pine tree had fallen near our site. It hadn't been there last year. Storms must have knocked it down, I said, but something about it didn't look right. The trunk was snapped about 6 feet up, not uprooted like you'd expect from wind damage. It looked like something had pushed it over. We finished setting up camp, tent, fire pit, hung our food pack from a tree branch, standard procedure to keep bears away. We spent the afternoon fishing and caught 4 decent-sized walleye for dinner. Everything seemed normal again, and I forgot about Earl's story. After dinner, we sat by the fire until about 10, then turned in. I remember having trouble falling asleep, partly because our air mattress had a slow leak, but also because something just felt off. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind in the trees or maybe a raccoon nosing around. But then I heard heavy footsteps, much too heavy for a raccoon or even a deer. They were slow, deliberate steps coming from the direction of the fallen tree. "Kim," I whispered, shaking her shoulder. "Wake up." "What?" she mumbled, half asleep. "There's something outside." We both lay there, frozen, listening. The footsteps stopped right next to our tent. Then came the breathing, deep, heavy breathing that made the hair on my arms stand up. Whatever it was big, and it was standing literally 2 feet from our heads, just on the other side of the tent fabric. Kim squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. I reached for the flashlight, but couldn't bring myself to turn it on or make any noise. The thing stood there breathing for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then it moved toward our food pack. We heard the rope snapping as it pulled down the pack we'd hung up. There was the sound of our cooler being opened, plastic bags tearing, cans rolling on the ground. It was going through our food, but not like a bear would. This was more methodical, like it was selecting things. After about 5 minutes of this, the footsteps moved away, back toward the fallen tree. The forest went silent again. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. We just lay there, listening, barely breathing ourselves. When the first light of dawn came through the tent, I finally worked up the courage to look outside. Our campsite looked like a tornado hit it. Food wrappers everywhere, our cooler tipped over, contents strewn about. But what struck me as weird was what was missing, specifically all our meat. The package of bacon, beef jerky, even the leftover fish from dinner, all gone. The granola bars, fruit and bread were untouched. That was definitely a bear, Kim said, but she didn't sound convinced. Bears don't usually pick and choose like that. They take everything edible. We spent the morning cleaning up and trying to convince ourselves it was just a bear. Around 10, I went to collect more firewood near the fallen tree. That's when I saw it, a footprint in the soft dirt beside the tree. It was shaped like a human foot, but massive, easily 16 inches long and incredibly wide. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was extremely heavy. I'm not a tracking expert, but I know what bear prints look like, and this wasn't one. Bears have distinct paw prints with claw marks at the top. This was clearly a foot, with 5 toes, a heel, an arch, just scaled up to an impossible size. I took a picture of it with my phone, then hurried back to camp. When I showed Kim, her face went pale. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." She didn't argue. We started packing up immediately, working quickly and quietly. I kept looking over at the fallen tree, feeling like we were being watched. We were about halfway done when we heard it, rustling from the dense brush behind the fallen tree. At first we froze, then continued packing even faster. The rustling got louder, and I could see the tops of some smaller trees moving about 50 yards into the forest. Something big was moving toward us. "Get to the boat," I told Kim. "I'll grab the rest." She hesitated. "I'm not leaving you here. Just start loading what we've packed. I'll keep an eye on whatever that is." Kim grabbed our bags and headed for the shore while I quickly collapsed the tent, constantly glancing toward the movement in the trees. That's when I saw it. Between two pines about 30 yards away, something was standing watching us. At first, all I could make out was a dark shape, taller than the surrounding brush. Then it moved forward slightly, and I got my first clear look. It was at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, covered in dark brown hair or fur that hung in matted clumps. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, like a linebacker on steroids. But it was the face that made my blood turn to ice. It wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal, somewhere horrifyingly in between. The features were flatter than a human's, with a pronounced brow ridge and a wide nose that reminded me of a gorilla. But the eyes, they were eerily intelligent, watching us with what I can only describe as calculated interest. "Kim," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to go right now." She was at the boat and turned to see what I was looking at. I heard her gasp. The creature took another step forward, now fully visible at the edge of the clearing. We moved together toward the boat, never turning our backs on the thing. It matched our movements, walking parallel to us, but keeping its distance. There was a deliberateness to its movements that terrified me. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. It felt like it was thinking, assessing. We reached the boat, and I helped Kim in first, then started pushing us off the shore while keeping my eyes on the creature. That's when it started moving faster, closing the distance between us with long, swinging strides. I jumped into the boat and frantically pulled the starter cord on the outboard motor. It sputtered but didn't catch. The creature was at the water's edge now, barely 20 feet away. I pulled again. Nothing. It let out a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between that echoed across the lake. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the starter cord. The thing picked up a thick branch from the ground, had to be 6 feet long and heavy, and for one horrible moment I thought it was going to throw it at us like a spear. Instead, it slammed it against a nearby tree with such force that the branch shattered. I yanked the cord one more time, and the engine finally caught. We lurched away from the shore just as the creature waded into the water up to its knees. It threw something, I think it was a rock, that hit the water just behind us. As we sped away, I looked back to see it still standing there, watching us go. It didn't roar or chase after us, just stood perfectly still until we rounded the bend and it disappeared from view. We made it back to the main lake in record time. When people at the marina asked why we'd cut our trip short, we mumbled something about an aggressive bear. Who would believe the truth? We never told anyone the full story. I deleted the footprint photo a few days later. Seeing it on my phone gave me nightmares. We still go to Dakina every summer. It's tradition, after all. But we've never gone back to Stinger Lake, and we never will. Sometimes I think about reporting what we saw to someone, a park ranger maybe, or one of those Bigfoot research groups. But then what? Best case, they think I'm crazy. Worst case, they believe me, and other people go looking for that thing. Whatever it was we saw that day, it belongs out there in those woods, and I hope to God it stays there. Story 4. I don't talk about this much. Most people just think you're crazy or making it up for attention. But what happened to me in 2004 has stuck with me for almost 20 years now. And sometimes I just need to get it off my chest with people who might actually understand. I've been fly fishing since I was 12. My dad taught me, and it's always been my escape when life gets too hectic. By the time I was 35, I was taking solo camping trips a few times a year just to decompress and spend time on the water. That May, I headed out to the Tucannon River in southeast Washington for a 3-day trip. I'd fished there before and knew some good spots where you could get away from other people. I arrived Thursday afternoon and set up camp about a quarter-mile from the river in a small clearing. Nothing fancy, just my 2-person tent, a small fire pit, and my gear. I brought my 2 dogs with me, Cooper and Jasper, both lab mixes that were great camping companions. They were well trained and usually stuck close to camp. Friday morning, I woke up before sunrise, made some coffee on my small camp stove, and headed down to the river while the dogs ate their breakfast. I left them at camp since they'd just disturbed the water. The morning was cool and misty, perfect fishing conditions. I made my way to a bend in the river I'd spotted on my previous visit, where the current slowed and created a deep pool that looked promising for rainbow trout. I was alone out there, which was exactly what I wanted. The closest campground was about 3 miles away, and I hadn't seen any other vehicles on the access road when I drove in. It was just me, the river, and the forest. I'd been fishing for maybe 45 minutes when I first heard it. A distinct knocking sound coming from across the river. At first, I didn't think much of it. Could be someone hammering something at a campsite I couldn't see, or maybe a woodpecker, though it sounded deeper than that. But after it continued, I started paying more attention. The knocking had a pattern to it. 2 deep, resonant knocks, then silence for a few minutes, then 2 more knocks. After about the 3rd or 4th sequence, I realized this wasn't random. The knocks were evenly spaced, always in pairs, and had the same tone and volume each time. It sounded like someone striking a hollow log with something solid. I stopped casting and just listened. The knocks seemed to be coming from the same spot each time, somewhere in the tree line across the river, maybe 100 yards upstream from where I was standing. I remember feeling curious but not scared, just wondering who else might be out here and what they were doing. After about 20 minutes, the knocking stopped completely. I went back to fishing, but I kept glancing across the river, half expecting to see another fisherman or hiker emerge from the trees. I had just made a cast when something made me look up again. I don't know if it was movement I caught in my peripheral vision or just some instinct, but when I turned my head toward the area where the knocking had come from, my heart nearly stopped. Standing just at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by a stand of young fir trees, but clearly visible, was something I still struggled to describe. My first thought wasn't Bigfoot or Sasquatch. It was simply, what the hell is that? Because my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. He was standing upright like a man, but so much larger. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing towered over what a person should be, easily 8 feet tall, probably more. Its body was massive, with shoulders that must have been twice as wide as mine. It was covered in dark brown hair or fur that hung longer from its arms than the rest of its body. Those arms were wrong, too long for its body, hanging down almost to where knees would be. I could see its hands clearly, huge things with what looked like dark skin on the palms, visible when it slightly raised one arm. Its head sat forward on its shoulders with almost no neck visible, and its face... I couldn't make out fine details from that distance, but it had a flat, heavy-browed face with eyes that looked deeply set. They weren't glowing or red or anything Hollywood would come up with, just dark, watchful eyes, in a face that wasn't human, but wasn't exactly animal either. I froze completely. My fishing rod was still extended mid-cast, and I remember the strange feeling of water rushing around my waders while the rest of me was absolutely still. I don't know how long we stared at each other, maybe 30 seconds, maybe several minutes. Time felt suspended. The creature made no aggressive moves. It just stood there, watching me. I could see its chest moving with deep, slow breaths. It seemed as calm as I was terrified. What struck me most was how deliberate everything felt. This wasn't some animal that had accidentally wandered into view. It knew I was there. Those knocks had been intentional. I'm certain of that now. It had been announcing its presence before choosing to show itself. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it simply turned and walked back into the forest. No dramatic exit, no roaring or chest beating. It just turned with this fluid motion and walked away between the trees. Something that big should have made noise moving through the underbrush, but I didn't hear a thing. It was just gone. I stood there for several more minutes, unable to move. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my fishing rod in the water and had to wade in deeper to retrieve it. I kept looking at the spot where it had been standing, half expecting it to reappear, but there was nothing. I don't remember packing up my gear or walking back to camp. I just remember suddenly being there, sitting on a log by my cold fire pit, trying to process what I'd seen. The dogs seemed normal when I got back, excited to see me like always. I debated breaking camp right then, but something made me stay. Curiosity, maybe, or the feeling that if it had wanted to harm me, it could have. I spent the rest of the day close to camp, cleaning the one fish I'd caught before the encounter and just sitting with the dogs. I kept looking toward the river, listening for those knocks again, but heard nothing unusual. As evening approached, I built a fire and tried to act normal, like I was just having a regular camping trip. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I knew about Bigfoot stories, of course, everyone does, but I'd always filed them away with UFOs and the Loch Ness Monster, things that make for good stories, but aren't actually real. That night was when things got even stranger. The dogs, who normally loved sleeping outside the tent on their blankets during camping trips, refused to stay outside. Cooper actually whined until I let him in, and Jasper followed right after. These were not nervous dogs. They were 70-pound labs who had faced down coyotes without blinking. But that night, they wanted to be in the tent. I managed to fall asleep eventually, but around midnight, I woke up to both dogs growling, not barking, just low, warning growls directed toward the woods on the riverside of our camp. I listened for what felt like hours, but heard nothing. The dogs eventually settled down, but they stayed alert, and I barely slept after that. At first light, I made coffee and decided to go back to the spot where I'd seen the creature. The dogs wouldn't leave the campsite. They sat at the edge and whined when I tried to get them to follow me. That was enough to make the hair on my arms stand up, but I had to know. I walked slowly down to the river and crossed at a shallow point about 50 yards downstream from where I'd been fishing. The morning was clear, no mist this time, and everything looked so normal it was almost maddening. Had I imagined the whole thing? But when I reached the area where the creature had stood, I found evidence I wasn't crazy. Several young saplings had broken limbs, clean breaks, not tears, at about 8 feet high. No bear or normal wildlife could have done that. And in one muddy patch near the river's edge, there was a partial impression that might have been a footprint, though it was too distorted to make out clearly. I didn't stay long. Something about being on that side of the river made me deeply uneasy, like I was trespassing. I hurried back to camp, packed everything up, and was driving out before 9 in the morning. I've gone back and forth 1,000 times about what I saw that day. I've read everything I can find about Sasquatch encounters, and many details match. The knocking sounds, the height, the proportions, but reading about something and seeing it with your own eyes are completely different experiences. What stays with me most is the intelligence I sensed in those eyes. This wasn't just some animal. The knocking, the deliberate appearance and departure, it all felt like communication, like it was setting boundaries. I know you're here, and now you know I'm here too. I've been back to the Toucanon since then, but never to that same spot. I still fish, still camp, but never alone anymore, and I always listen for knocking in the woods. To this day, I can't explain what I saw, but I know what I saw, and it saw me too. Story 5 says, I still can't explain what happened to us that summer in Alaska. It's been 18 years, and I've tried to rationalize it 1,000 different ways, but nothing makes sense. I'm writing this down because I need to get it out of my system, even though my brother Michael doesn't like talking about it. Back in 2005, Mike and I planned this fishing trip about 30 miles outside of Fairbanks. We'd found this perfect spot a few years earlier, totally secluded, great fishing in the river about 50 yards downhill from where we'd set up camp, right at the edge of this dense tree line. The kind of place where you could really disconnect from everything and everyone. We arrived on a Monday afternoon in late July. The drive out there took longer than we remembered, and the hike in with all our gear was rough. But man, when we got there it was exactly as beautiful as we remembered. We set up our tent, got our fishing gear ready, and built a fire pit. Everything was normal at first, except for one thing that I noticed but didn't mention to Mike until later. It was weirdly quiet, like unnaturally quiet. In Alaska, especially in summer, the woods are usually alive with sounds, birds chirping, small animals rustling through underbrush, the occasional distant wolf howl. But there was none of that, just the sound of the river below us and the wind in the trees. When I finally mentioned it to Mike on the second day, he admitted he'd noticed it too, but didn't want to jinx our trip by bringing it up. Probably just means there's a predator nearby, he said. Bear or something, keeping the small critters quiet. That made sense, and we'd dealt with bears before, so we were careful with our food and trash. The first 2 days were uneventful. We caught plenty of fish, had some beers around the campfire, talked about work and family stuff. Normal brother things. The quiet was still there, but we got used to it. Then came the third night. We'd gone to bed around 10, exhausted from a full day of hiking and fishing. I was deep asleep when this massive crack woke us both up. It was like a gunshot, but deeper, like a tree falling or something. We both sat bolt upright. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered. It was around 2 in the morning, according to my watch. The sound had come from maybe 100 yards away, in the dense part of the forest. Probably just a tree falling, I said, but something felt off. Trees fall in forests all the time, but this sounded deliberate somehow. Mike grabbed his flashlight and his rifle. I took mine too, and we stepped outside the tent. The moon was bright enough that we could see pretty well, but the flashlights helped cut through the shadows in the trees. We called out a few times, thinking maybe another camper was nearby, though that seemed unlikely given how remote we were. We searched for about 20 minutes, but found nothing unusual. As we headed back to the tent, Mike's light caught something weird. A thick branch about 8 feet up on a tree had been snapped clean off, not broken by weather or rotting, just snapped. The break was fresh, with sap still oozing. "Bear, maybe?" I suggested, but we both knew bears don't typically break branches that high up, and certainly not that cleanly. We went back to the tent, but neither of us slept much after that. I kept listening for more sounds, and I swear I could feel something watching us from the tree line. The next day was tense. We fished and hiked like normal, but we were both on edge. We kept our voices lower and stayed closer to camp than we had the previous days. That night, we built our fire bigger than usual and stayed up later, neither of us eager to go into the tent. Around 11, we finally turned in, but I couldn't sleep. I just lay there listening. Mike dozed off eventually, but I stayed awake, staring at the tent ceiling. Then around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps circling our tent. I nudged Mike awake and put my finger to my lips. He heard it too. Whatever was out there was big, based on how heavily it stepped, but it moved with purpose, not like a wandering animal. The footsteps circled our tent twice and then stopped right outside the entrance. That's when we heard the breathing. Deep, controlled breathing that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever encountered. Not the huffing of a bear or the panting of a wolf. This was almost human-like, but deeper, more powerful. We froze, barely breathing ourselves, as this thing stood just feet away from us, with only the thin tent material between us. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, the footsteps retreated back toward the tree line. Neither of us moved or spoke for at least an hour afterward. When the sky finally started to lighten around 4 in the morning, we cautiously emerged from the tent. That's when we saw them. Footprints. Massive footprints in the soft earth around our campsite. They were roughly 16 inches long, much wider than a normal human foot, and deeply impressed into the ground. Whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The stride length between prints was huge too, easily twice what a tall human would leave. Mike and I just stared at them, then at each other. We didn't need to say anything. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk on two legs for that long, and these prints had 5 toes, clearly defined. They weren't boots either. There was no tread pattern, just smooth foot impressions. "We should leave," Mike finally said, but I was stubborn. And waste the whole trip? It was probably just a moose or something. Even as I said it, I knew it was ridiculous. Moose don't walk on 2 legs, and they don't breathe like that. But I didn't want to admit I was scared, and I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. Mike reluctantly agreed to stay one more night, but we spent the day fishing right next to each other, never letting the other out of sight. We talked about what it could have been. A bear walking funny, maybe a prankster from another campsite we hadn't discovered yet, though that seemed impossible given our location. As the sun started to set, we built our fire even bigger than the night before. We cooked our dinner early and decided to stay up all night if necessary. We had our rifles within reach and positioned ourselves so we could see the tree line in all directions. The sun went down around 10, and for a couple of hours, everything was quiet except for the crackling of our fire. We kept it well fed, the flames casting our shadows long across the campsite. I was just starting to think maybe the previous night had been some weird shared hallucination when we heard it. Footsteps again, but this time approaching from the opposite side of the camp from the night before. Slow, heavy steps coming from the direction of the river. Mike and I both grabbed our rifles and stood up. "Hey," Mike shouted, "we know you're there." The footsteps stopped. For maybe 10 seconds, there was complete silence. Then, from the darkness beyond the reach of our firelight, came this sound, a grunt that turned into something like a growl, but not from any animal I've ever heard. It was deep and resonant, like it came from something with a massive chest cavity. Then all hell broke loose. There was crashing through the underbrush, not moving away from us, but toward us and fast. We didn't wait to see what it was. We grabbed our backpacks that we'd thankfully packed with essentials earlier, just in case, snatched up our rifles, and ran. We left the tent, the cooler with our food, most of our fishing gear, just abandoned it all and took off toward the trail that led back to where we'd parked the truck. We ran like our lives depended on it, stumbling through the dark, with just our flashlights bouncing wildly ahead of us. I swear I could hear it behind us for the first quarter mile or so, crashing through the forest. Then, suddenly the sounds stopped. We didn't. We kept running until our lungs burned, then power walked the rest of the way to the truck. It took us almost 2 hours to reach it, and we didn't stop once to rest. We drove straight back to Fairbanks that night, barely speaking. The next morning, after a few hours of sleep in a motel, we called a couple of friends and convinced them to come back with us to get our stuff. Safety in numbers, we figured. When we got back to the campsite around noon, everything was trashed. The tent was collapsed, though not torn. Our fishing gear was scattered around, but the cooler, that was the strangest part. Our heavy-duty cooler had been ripped open, not torn by claws or chewed by teeth, but literally pulled apart. The plastic was twisted and warped, like someone had just grabbed both sides and wrenched it open through sheer force. The food inside was gone, wrappers and packaging scattered in a 20-foot radius. Our friends thought it was a bear, despite our protests that the damage didn't match bear behavior. We gathered what was salvageable and got out of there as quickly as possible. I've never been back to that spot, and neither has Mike. We've gone camping and fishing plenty of times since then, but always in more populated areas, never that deep in the wilderness. Some people have suggested we hallucinated or exaggerated what happened, that it was just a bear or a moose, and our imaginations ran wild. Others have thrown out theories about Bigfoot or some undiscovered species. I don't know what it was. I just know that for those few nights in the Alaskan wilderness, something was watching us, something that didn't want us there, something that wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, and definitely wasn't human. And to this day, whenever I hear a branch snap in the woods or footsteps outside my tent when I'm camping, I freeze, waiting to hear that deep, controlled breathing again. Story 6. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. It happened back on September 1st, 2019, and honestly, I still don't know what to make of it. I'm not the type of guy who believes in crazy stuff. I'm pretty level-headed. Ask anyone who knows me. I work in construction, pay my taxes, and mind my own business. But what I saw that morning has been stuck in my head ever since. I'm big into archery. Have been for about 15 years now. It's my way of unwinding. There's something therapeutic about focusing on a target and blocking everything else out. That Sunday morning, I decided to head out early to the range on Corduroy Road in Cambridge, where the Great Guernsey Trail starts. It's a nice spot, usually pretty quiet, especially early in the morning. I figured I'd get a good hour or two of practice in before the place got busy. I got there around 7 in the morning. The sun was just coming up, and there was still a bit of mist hanging over the field. It was cool, maybe 60 degrees, and dead quiet, except for some birds and the occasional car passing by on the distant road. Perfect conditions for shooting. I was the only one there, which wasn't unusual for that time on a Sunday. I set up at the 40-yard line, got my gear ready, and started warming up. I wasn't shooting particularly well at first. My first few arrows were all over the place. After about 15 minutes, I finally got into a rhythm and started hitting closer to the bullseye. I remember checking my watch at around 7:15 and thinking I had about 45 minutes before other people would likely start showing up. That's when I noticed something weird. At first, it was just a feeling. You know that sensation when you think someone's watching you? I tried to ignore it and focus on my shooting, but it kept nagging at me. After I loosed an arrow, I paused and scanned the tree line behind my target. The range backs up to a pretty dense wooded area, and the targets are set up maybe 10 yards from where the trees start. That's when I saw it. About 12 yards behind my target, slightly to the right, something was peeking out from behind a tree. At first I thought maybe it was a kid who'd wandered onto the range, which would have been dangerous as hell, but something wasn't right about the shape. I squinted, trying to get a better look. Whatever it was stood about 4 to 5 feet tall and was partially hidden behind a thick oak tree. The thing that immediately struck me as bizarre was that it seemed to be covered in dark, reddish-brown hair. Not like a coat or clothing, like fur or hair that was part of it. The hair looked shaggy, especially around what I assumed was its head. It was watching me. I could tell because I could see the side of its face pressed against the tree as it peered out. Its face was hard to make out clearly at that distance, but it was darker than the hair on its body, with what looked like a flatter nose than a human's. Now, I'm not saying it was Bigfoot or anything, I'm just telling you what I saw. But it definitely wasn't a bear or a deer or any animal I've ever seen in Ohio, and I've hunted these woods my whole life. I froze for a second. Arrow nocked but not drawn, just staring. The creature didn't move either. We just looked at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. I wasn't scared exactly, more confused and fascinated. It didn't seem aggressive. If anything, it seemed curious, like it was studying what I was doing. I slowly raised my bow and took aim at the target again, keeping the creature in my peripheral vision. It didn't run away. I shot the arrow, hitting just outside the bullseye, and when I looked back, the creature was still there, watching. Its head was tilted slightly, like it was trying to understand what I was doing. I decided to test something. I put my bow down and started walking toward my target to collect my arrows. The moment I took a few steps forward, the creature quickly ducked completely behind the tree. It moved fast, surprisingly fast, but not in a way that seemed panicked, more like it was playing a game. I pulled my arrows from the target, all the while looking toward that tree, but the creature remained hidden. As soon as I turned and walked back to the firing line, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. When I got back to my position and turned around, there it was again, peeking out from the same spot. This weird game continued for about 20 minutes. Every time I shot, it watched intently. Every time I walked up to the target, it hid. Every time I returned to shoot, it peeked out again. I started to feel less weirded out and more intrigued. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't threatening me. It seemed almost playful, like a kid playing peekaboo. After a while, I decided I needed to document this. Nobody would believe me otherwise. I remembered I had my phone in my truck, which was parked about 50 yards behind the firing line. I carefully set my bow down and slowly backed away, not wanting to startle the creature. It kept watching me even as I moved toward my truck. I jogged to my vehicle, fumbled with my keys, and grabbed my phone from the center console. The whole thing took maybe 45 seconds, but when I turned around, phone in hand, ready to capture evidence of whatever the hell I was seeing, I couldn't spot the creature anymore. I walked back to the firing line, phone at the ready, scanning the tree line. Nothing. I waited for 5 minutes, then 10. Still nothing. The creature was gone. I decided to investigate. I walked past my target and approached the tree where I'd seen it. The ground was soft from rain the previous day, and there were definitely tracks there. Not human footprints, but not clearly animal either. They were about the size of a kid's foot, but wider, with what looked like 5 toes. The impressions weren't deep enough to make out clear details. They led away from the tree and deeper into the woods. I thought about following them, but something held me back. I'm not exactly a coward, but the idea of tracking this thing into the dense woods alone didn't seem smart. What if it wasn't alone? What if it had led me to this spot for a reason? As I stood there debating what to do, I heard a rustling sound deeper in the woods. It wasn't the normal sound of a squirrel or bird moving through the underbrush. It was heavier, more deliberate. Then I heard what sounded like a soft, high-pitched vocalization, almost like a child's whimper, but not quite human. It made the hair on my arm stand up. That was enough for me. I backed away slowly, returned to the firing line, and packed up my gear. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time, feeling like I was being watched from multiple directions now. The peaceful feeling from earlier was completely gone. As I was putting my bow case in the truck, another archer pulled into the parking lot. He was an older guy I'd seen around the range before but didn't know well. He nodded at me and asked if the range was busy. I hesitated, wondering if I should tell him what I'd seen. In the end, I just shook my head and said I was just leaving. What was I supposed to say? Hey, watch out for the small, hairy creature playing peekaboo in the woods. He'd think I was nuts. I drove home in a daze, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head since then. Was it a juvenile Sasquatch, some unknown species, a kid in a costume playing a prank? But who would send their kid into the woods at 7 in the morning to mess with archers? And the hair covering it looked too natural, too much a part of it to be a costume. The weirdest part was how it seemed to understand what was happening, hiding when I approached, reappearing when I was back at a distance. There was intelligence there, and that sound I heard in the woods. I still get chills thinking about it. I went back to that range a week later, earlier in the morning, hoping I might see it again. I even brought my phone ready this time, but there was nothing. I've returned several times since then, always early, always alone, but I've never seen the creature again. I've read about Sasquatch sightings in Ohio before, but always brushed them off as stories from people who'd had too much to drink or were looking for attention. Now, I'm not so sure. I don't know what I saw that morning, but it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist, according to science. I haven't told many people about this. My wife knows, and she believes me because she knows I'm not the type to make up stories. A couple close friends know too, but I can tell they think I either imagined it or am exaggerating something mundane. That's why I'm sharing it here. I know you folks won't immediately dismiss me as crazy. Sometimes I wonder if that young creature is still out there, watching people from behind trees. Sometimes I wonder if it tells its family about the strange human it saw shooting arrows at a target. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever get answers. All I know for sure is that for about 20 minutes on a quiet Sunday morning in September, I shared a strange connection with something that shouldn't exist, and nothing has felt quite the same since. Story 7. I still can't believe what I saw that night. It's been 18 years, but sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat thinking about those eyes watching us from the tree line. I've never really told this story outside of a few close friends because, well, who would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest. It was the summer of 2006, late June. School had just let out for the year, and like any 16-year-old with a fresh driver's license and access to my mom's Honda Civic, freedom was all I cared about. Me and my two best friends, Matt and Tyler, had this spot we'd go to at the forest preserve near Watum Lake in Indiana. It wasn't anything special, just a small gravel cutoff about half a mile down this service road where we could park and hang out without anyone bothering us. That night started like any other summer night. We grabbed some snacks from the gas station, those disgusting energy drinks that were popular back then, some Doritos, the usual teenage diet. We headed out to our spot around 9:30. It was still light out when we got there, but the sun was setting fast, casting long shadows through the trees. We parked facing the woods, with the lake somewhere behind us through the trees, though you couldn't see it from where we were. The forest preserve was pretty dense in that area. Lots of old oak trees, thick underbrush. There was a small clearing about 20 feet in front of where we parked, and then the woods just got darker and thicker beyond that. We were just sitting there with the windows down, radio playing quietly, talking about nothing important. Video games, this girl Tyler had a crush on, normal stuff. I remember it was getting to be twilight, that weird time when everything starts looking a little different, a little off. The mosquitoes were starting to come out, and I was thinking we should probably roll up the windows soon. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or maybe a trick of the fading light. There was this massive oak tree at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 feet away, and on the side of it, wrapped around from behind, was this hand, a fucking huge hand. Like not human-sized at all. It was gripping the tree trunk, and I could see every detail of it even from that distance. The hand was covered in this blackish-brown hair. Not fur like a bear, but hair, longer and coarser. The fingers were thick, way thicker than any human's, and I could see the muscles and tendons underneath the skin when it gripped the tree. The skin itself looked almost leathery where it showed through on the palm and fingertips. There was this reddish tint to the hair where the last bit of sunlight caught it. I remember freezing mid-sentence. Matt was saying something about the new Xbox game he'd gotten, and I just stopped responding. I couldn't look away from that hand. "Dude, what's wrong?" Tyler asked, following my gaze. Before I could answer, the owner of the hand slowly leaned out from behind the tree, just its head, peeking out like it was checking us out. Holy shit! That head, it was massive, covered in the same blackish-brown hair as the hand. The face was... I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. Not quite human. Definitely not a bear or any animal I recognized. The eyes were deep-set and dark, watching us with what seemed like intelligence. The top of its head was rounded, with that hair standing up slightly, making it look even bigger. It only looked at us for maybe 2 seconds before pulling back behind the tree, but those 2 seconds felt like forever. None of us said a word. We just sat there, frozen. Then Tyler whispered, "What the fuck was that?" The fear hit me all at once. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands went numb and tingly. That thing was huge, based on where that hand was positioned on the tree, which had to be at least 7 feet up. Whatever we were looking at had to be 8 feet tall, minimum. "Start the car," Matt said from the back seat, his voice higher than normal. "Jason, start the fucking car." I fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them. The whole time, I couldn't take my eyes off that tree, waiting for the thing to step out fully. The engine started, and I threw it in reverse so fast I almost hit the gas before shifting. As we backed out, headlights sweeping across the trees, I caught another glimpse of movement. Just for a split second, I thought I saw it shift positions, moving to another tree, but it was so quick I couldn't be sure. The darkness had really set in by then, and the shadows were playing tricks. We tore down that service road way faster than was safe, nobody saying a word until we hit the main road. Then everyone started talking at once. "Did you see that fucking thing? What the hell was it? A bear? Do bears even get that big?" But I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't have hands like that. They don't peek around trees like they're trying to hide, and they definitely don't have that look in their eyes, that awareness. We drove straight to this 24-hour diner in town and sat there for hours, trying to process what we'd seen. We kept going back and forth between nervous laughter and serious theories. Tyler was convinced it was someone in a costume pranking us. Matt thought maybe it was some kind of escaped zoo animal, though he couldn't explain what kind. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. The proportions were all wrong for a human in a costume. The movement was too natural, too fluid. And those eyes, they were looking at us, studying us. We made a pact not to tell anyone else. Who would believe us anyway? 3 teenagers claiming they saw some giant hairy monster in the woods. We'd be laughed out of school. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep right. Every noise outside my window made me jump. I kept replaying those few seconds over and over in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. I found myself looking up weird animal sightings in Indiana, reading about black bears, which aren't even supposed to be in our area. Anything to make sense of it. About a month later, I finally worked up the courage to go back to that spot, alone. I know, stupid decision, but I had to know if I'd imagined the whole thing or blown it out of proportion. I went in the middle of the day, parked in the exact same spot, and just sat there scanning the trees. Nothing happened, of course, but I did get out and walk over to that oak tree. The trunk was massive, easily 3 feet in diameter. I reached up as high as I could to touch where I thought that hand had been, and my fingertips barely brushed the spot. Whatever had gripped that tree had to have been standing flat-footed and still reached up almost 2 feet higher than I could. I noticed something else too. On the bark, there were these deep indentations, like something had dug its fingers in. They were weathered, could have been from anything, but they were spaced out exactly like fingers would be. I took off pretty quickly after that. Over the years, Matt, Tyler, and I grew apart as friends do. We never really talked about that night again, except once at a graduation party when we'd had a few beers. Even then, we just kind of acknowledged it happened without going into details, like it was this weird shared dream we all had. It wasn't until years later, when I was in college, that I stumbled across a documentary about Bigfoot sightings. I nearly dropped my laptop when they started describing encounters just like ours. The height, the hair color, the way it moved, how it would peek from behind trees. They even mentioned that reddish tint to the hair that I'd seen. I've spent a lot of time since then reading accounts from other people who've seen similar things. Some of the details match so perfectly with what we saw that night that it gives me chills. I'm convinced now that what we encountered at Raccoon Lake was a Bigfoot. I've never gone back to that specific spot in the forest preserve. Something about knowing it was there, watching us, possibly following us. It just creeps me out too much. What was it doing? Was it curious, territorial, just passing through? The thing that still bothers me most is those eyes. They weren't animal eyes. There was something in them. Intelligence, awareness. Like it was thinking, assessing us. Sometimes I wonder if we surprised it as much as it surprised us. I still live in Indiana, about an hour from Raccoon Lake. Every so often I hear stories about strange noises in those woods, or hunters finding weird tracks they can't identify. I never contribute to those conversations, just listen, but each time I get that same cold feeling down my spine that I had sitting in that car, watching that massive hand grip the tree. The rational part of my brain still tries to explain it away. A bear standing on its hind legs, shadows playing tricks, teenage imagination running wild. But deep down, I know what I saw. That hand was real. Those eyes were real. Whatever was watching us from the woods that night was real. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night and pass a wooded area, I can't help but glance at the tree line, half expecting to see a large shape moving between the trunks, or a pair of dark eyes reflecting my headlights back at me. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what happened that night. All I know is that there's something out there in those woods that science hasn't explained yet, and it knows we're here. Story 8. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened to us that winter. It's been 15 years, and I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear those sounds outside my window. My husband says I need to let it go, but how do you forget something that completely changes the way you look at the world? It was the winter of 2008 to 2009, one of the worst we'd had in years. We'd moved to our house near Hope, New Jersey about 2 years earlier. Martin, my husband, had gotten a good deal on this property, probably because it was so isolated. Our closest neighbor was about half a mile away, and the house sat at the end of this winding back road, surrounded by dense woods. Our kids, Mark and Jennifer, were 13 and 11 at the time. That December, we got hit with this massive snowstorm. Must have been at least 2 feet of snow, maybe more. The plow didn't even make it to our road for 3 days. We were essentially trapped, but we had plenty of food and a generator, so we weren't too worried. The kids were thrilled to have snow days from school. Everything was fine until that first night. I remember it clearly because I was up late finishing a book in the living room. Martin had already gone to bed. It was around 11:30 when I heard it, this long, drawn-out howl that seemed to echo through the trees. At first I thought maybe it was just the wind, but then it happened again. It wasn't like a wolf or a coyote. Those I'd heard before. This was different. Louder, more deliberate. Almost like a person trying to mimic an animal, but not quite getting it right. I went to the window and peered out into the darkness. Our yard lights illuminated the snow, making everything bright despite it being the middle of the night. I couldn't see anything moving out there, but I had this feeling, this horrible, sinking feeling, that something was watching me. I decided I was being silly and went to bed, not mentioning it to Martin. But the next night, around the same time, we both heard it. We were getting ready for bed when that same howl cut through the night air. Martin froze with his toothbrush halfway to his mouth. "What the hell was that?" he asked. I told him I'd heard it the night before. We went to the window together, but again, there was nothing to see, just snow and trees and darkness beyond our yard lights. By the third night, we were all on edge. The howls had started earlier, around 11, and seemed to be coming from multiple directions. It was like whatever was making those sounds was circling our property. The kids were scared. Jennifer kept asking if it was wolves, and we tried to reassure her that wolves haven't been in New Jersey for a century. But honestly, I wasn't sure what to tell them because I had no idea what we were dealing with. The next morning, Martin went outside to clear some of the snow from our driveway. He came back in looking pale. "Lisa, come look at this," he said quietly, trying not to alarm the kids who were eating breakfast. I bundled up and followed him outside. That's when I saw it. The drain pipes along the side of our house had been ripped completely off the wall. Not just one section, but 3 different sections, torn from their brackets and tossed several feet into the snow. These weren't flimsy plastic pipes either. They were metal, securely fastened to the house. Whatever had done this had serious strength, but what really sent a chill down my spine were the footprints. They circled around the entire house, massive impressions in the deep snow. They were clearly feet, not paws, with 5 toes clearly visible and a flat heel. The stride between them was enormous, at least 4 feet apart. Martin and I looked at each other, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. These weren't human footprints. "Don't tell the kids," he said. "I'll fix the pipes when the weather clears up." That night, we kept all the lights on in the house. None of us wanted to go to bed. Jennifer and Mark camped out in the living room with us, pretending it was fun to have a family sleepover, but I could see the fear in their eyes. We tried watching a movie to distract ourselves, but we were all listening for those sounds. They started just after midnight, but this time it wasn't just howls. There was a deliberate, rhythmic thumping against the side of our house. Thump, pause, thump, pause, thump. It was moving slowly around the perimeter of our home, like something was testing our walls. Martin grabbed the baseball bat we keep by the door and stood up. "Stay here," he whispered. No exclamation mark, I grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there." The thumping continued, moving from the living room wall toward the kitchen. We all sat frozen, barely breathing. Then it was at the kitchen window. Jennifer was facing that direction, and suddenly her eyes went wide. "There's something looking in," she whispered, her voice shaking. I turned just in time to see a dark shape move away from the gap in our kitchen curtains. All I caught was a glimpse, but it was tall, much taller than a person should be. And there was a reflection of light in what must have been its eyes. The thumping continued around to the back of the house, then stopped. For about 15 minutes, there was nothing. We sat in terrified silence, waiting. Then the howling started again, this time from the tree line, maybe 100 yards from the house. "It's okay," Martin said, trying to sound confident. "It's moving away." None of us slept that night, or the next, or the one after that. For an entire week, our lives became a nightmare of waiting for darkness to fall and those sounds to begin. We called the local police, but they couldn't get out to our property because of the snow. They suggested it might be teenagers playing pranks or maybe a bear, though they admitted bears should be hibernating this time of year. The strain was unbearable. I started having panic attacks. Martin wouldn't let the kids go outside even during the day. We kept all the curtains closed. The house felt like a prison, but we were too scared to leave. On what turned out to be the final night, the 7th night, something changed. Instead of starting at 11 or midnight, we heard nothing until nearly 1:30 in the morning. We'd been sitting in the living room, none of us able to sleep, when we heard 2 long, drawn-out howls from somewhere in the trees. Then a 3rd howl followed. Shorter, higher pitched, almost like a response. And then nothing. The silence was almost worse than the sounds had been. We waited all night, but nothing happened. No thumping, no shapes at the window, no more howls. The next day, Martin ventured outside with his shotgun to check around the property. The footprints were still there, partially filled in with fresh snow, but there were no new ones. The damaged drain pipes hung limply from where they'd been torn. Days passed, then weeks. The sounds never returned. When spring finally came and the snow melted, Martin fixed the drain pipes, but he never mentioned what had happened. None of us did. It was like we'd made some unspoken agreement to pretend it never occurred. But I know what I saw. I know what we all heard. Whatever was out there in those woods wasn't a bear, wasn't teenagers playing pranks. The local hunters I eventually got the courage to talk to months later had theories. Most of them mentioned Bigfoot. I would have laughed at that before, but now I'm not so sure. What still haunts me is the pattern of it all, the way it systematically circled our house, the way it seemed to be studying us, and those footprints, human-like but impossibly large. Sometimes I think about that final night, about those 3 distinct howls. It sounded almost like communication, like a family calling to each other in the dark. We stayed in that house for another 2 years before Martin got a job offer in Pennsylvania. We never spoke about our decision to move, but I know we were all relieved to leave. Jennifer still refuses to go camping or hiking. Mark developed insomnia that he struggles with to this day. Martin threw himself into work and rarely talks about anything personal anymore. As for me, I find myself standing at windows sometimes, staring out into the darkness, listening, waiting. Because deep down I know that whatever was watching us that winter is still out there in the woods somewhere. And I can't shake the feeling that one day it might come back. Story 9. I've been debating whether to post this for over a year now. I'm not the type who goes around telling crazy stories, and I've never been into the whole Bigfoot thing before. I'm a pretty quiet guy, keep to myself mostly. But what happened to me last October has been eating at me, and I need to get it off my chest. Maybe writing it down will help me process it. Maybe someone here has seen something similar. I live about 20 minutes outside Castlegar, British Columbia. It's beautiful country out here, mountains, forests, rivers. I've always been an outdoorsy type, though not in the extreme hiker or mountain climber way. I just like exploring old back roads, abandoned places, logging trails, places where you can feel alone with your thoughts, you know. It was late October 2021, unseasonably cold but clear. I had the day off from work and decided to check out this abandoned railway line I'd spotted on some maps. Nothing special about it, just an old overgrown railbed that hadn't seen a train in decades. The kind of place that tells a story about what used to be. I drove out there around 9 in the morning, maybe 9:30. The access road was barely more than a dirt path, but my truck handles that stuff fine. I parked at what looked like the closest point to the old railway, grabbed my backpack with water, a sandwich and my camera, and started hiking north along the railbed. The quiet hit me right away. I mean, the woods are usually quiet, but this was different. No birds, no squirrels, just the sound of my boots on the gravel and my own breathing. I remember thinking it was weird, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was the cold, or maybe I was just being paranoid. I'd been walking for about 45 minutes, taking it slow, stopping occasionally to snap pictures of rusted rail spikes or interesting rock formations. The trail curved around a bend where the trees thinned out a bit, giving way to a small clearing on one side and a steeper tree-covered slope on the other. That's when I saw it. About 70 or 80 yards ahead, on the uphill side of the trail, something was standing half hidden behind a massive tree. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A bear standing on its hind legs, maybe. But no, this thing was huge. 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and the proportions were all wrong for a bear. It had this massive chest and shoulders, not like a bodybuilder, but like a boulder that decided to stand up. That's the only way I can describe it. Solid, dense. Its arms hung down longer than they should have, with these massive hands dangling at its sides. I could see its face partially. Dark, grayish-brown skin around the eyes and forehead, almost like a person's butt. Not. The rest of its body was covered in this dark hair, black, or maybe very dark brown. It wasn't shaggy like you see in those cheesy Bigfoot shows. It was more like a thick, short coat. My whole body just locked up. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to make any sudden movements, not to run. I couldn't have moved if I wanted to. My legs felt like they were filled with concrete. We just stood there, staring at each other. I don't know how long exactly, maybe a minute, probably less, but it felt like forever. I remember my mouth going completely dry. I remember my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then it moved, just turned and disappeared into the brush. No noise. No crashing through the underbrush like you'd expect from something that size. Just gone. Silent. The silence afterward was the worst part. It felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I stood there for another 30 seconds, waiting. For what? I don't know. Maybe for it to come charging out at me. When nothing happened, I slowly, carefully turned around and started walking back toward my truck. Not running. Something told me running would be bad. But moving with purpose, you know? Every few steps I'd glance over my shoulder. The back of my neck was tingling the whole time, like when you know someone's watching you. I was about 10 minutes from my truck when I saw it again. This time it was deeper in the trees to my right, maybe 40 yards away, just peeking from behind a massive cedar, the same watching posture, just its head and part of its shoulder visible. Our eyes met again. I swear I could feel it looking right through me. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't making any threatening moves. It was just observing, studying me like I was the strange creature in its world. After a few seconds, it slowly pulled back behind the tree and was gone again. I stood frozen, waiting to see if it would reappear, but it didn't. Eventually, I continued toward my truck, but now I was checking in all directions constantly. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. When I finally reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I sat there for a minute, the doors locked, just trying to calm down enough to drive. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd seen, a guy in a costume. No way. We were miles from anywhere, and no costume could move like that or have those proportions. A bear, definitely not. This thing was bipedal, with a very distinct head and shoulders. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror like I expected to see it following me. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? Hey, I saw Bigfoot today. They'd think I was crazy. Hell, part of me thought I was crazy. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying it in my mind. The size of it, the way it moved, but mostly the intelligence in its eyes. That's what really got to me. There was awareness there, purpose. It wanted me to see it. It wanted me to know it was watching me. The next day, I went online and started researching Bigfoot sightings in the area. There have been quite a few over the years, especially around the Kootenays. Some of the descriptions matched what I saw pretty closely. I'd never given those stories much thought before. Figured they were just campfire tales or misidentifications. Now I wasn't so sure. For weeks afterward, I jumped at every noise outside my house. I stopped going into the woods alone. I even considered moving, but this is my home. Eventually, the immediate fear faded, but I couldn't stop thinking about that encounter. 6 months later, in April, I worked up the courage to go back. I don't know what I was expecting. Closure, maybe? Confirmation that I hadn't imagined the whole thing? I drove out to the same spot but stayed near my truck, just stood there, looking down that trail. The woods felt wrong again. That same unnatural quiet. No birds singing, no wind in the trees, just silence. I didn't see the creature again, but I knew it was there. Watching, waiting. After about 10 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I got back in my truck and left, and I haven't been back since. I still don't know what to make of what happened that day. I've always considered myself a rational person. I don't believe in ghosts or aliens or any of that stuff, but I know what I saw. It wasn't human, it wasn't any known animal, and the way it watched me, the way it seemed to want me to know it was there, that was the most unsettling part. Sometimes I think about going back with a camera trying to get proof. But then I remember the feeling of those eyes on me, and I know I never will. Whatever that thing was, it was letting me leave. I don't want to push my luck. I still go hiking sometimes, but never alone, and never in that area. When I'm in the woods now, I'm always listening for that silence, that unnatural quiet that means something's watching. And sometimes when I'm out on the trails and the birds suddenly stop singing, I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it standing there, watching me from behind a tree. So that's my story. I've never told anyone else before today. I'm not asking you to believe me. Hell, sometimes I still don't believe it myself. But it happened, and whatever that thing was, it's still out there in those woods, watching and waiting. And sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 10. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or anything paranormal. Growing up on a cattle ranch in Northern California, I was raised to be practical, to trust what I can see and touch. But something happened about 15 years ago that I still can't explain, and it changed how I look at the woods forever. I run a decent-sized cattle operation in Shasta County, leasing land near Dog Creek Road. Been doing it most of my adult life. I know these mountains, valleys, and forests like the back of my hand. I've seen bears, mountain lions, coyotes, all the usual wildlife you'd expect. I've spent countless nights alone in these woods and never felt anything but at home. That all changed in the fall of 2008. My buddy Conrad had a property about 14 miles from mine as the crow flies, much farther by the trails we had to take on horseback. He was an old-timer, lived way off the grid, the kind of guy who valued his privacy more than modern conveniences. No cell service, spotty electricity from a generator, and the nearest neighbor a good 40-minute ride away, just how he liked it. I remember that day clearly. It was late October, crisp, but not cold yet. The leaves were turning, and there was that earthy smell in the air that comes with autumn in the mountains. Me and my ranch hand, Diego, decided to ride out to Conrad's place to help him with some fencing before winter set in. We set out early, around 7 in the morning, knowing it would take us most of the day to get there and back. The ride was uneventful. We followed logging roads and game trails, crossing a couple of small streams. Diego and I talked about cattle prices and local gossip, nothing important. When we finally reached Conrad's place around midday, something felt off right away. Conrad wasn't outside working like he normally would be. His dogs, 3 big German shepherds that would usually come running and barking at any visitor, were huddled on his porch, looking nervous. Not at all their usual behavior. "Conrad?" I called out as we dismounted and tied our horses to the hitching post. He came out of his cabin looking like he hadn't slept. His normally neat appearance was disheveled, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. "Frank," he said, nodding at me and Diego. "Didn't expect company today." "We came to help with that north fence line," I reminded him. "Everything all right? Your dogs seem spooked." Conrad glanced at his dogs, then back at us. He seemed to be debating something internally. "Come inside," he finally said. "I need to show you something." We followed him in. Conrad's cabin was simple but comfortable. One large room with a kitchen area, a wood stove, and a bed in the corner. He motioned for us to sit at his small table while he poured coffee. His hands were shaking slightly. "Something happened yesterday," he started, setting mugs in front of us. "I got a nice buck early in the morning, 4-pointer, shot him clean, field dressed him, and hung him up on that big oak behind the house to cool overnight. You know the one." I nodded. It was a massive oak with a sturdy branch about 9 feet off the ground, perfect for hanging game. "So I'm sitting here after dark, maybe around 9 o'clock, reading by lamplight. The dogs were out on the porch like usual. Then they start acting strange, whining, pawing at the door, wanting in. These dogs don't scare easy, Frank. They've faced down bears before without blinking." Conrad took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant. "I let them in, and they huddled in the corner there," he pointed. "Tails between their legs, shaking. Then I heard it." "Heard what?" Diego asked. "A scream. Not like anything I've ever heard before. Not a mountain lion. I know that sound. Not a bear. Not a coyote. It sounded almost human, but not quite. Deeper, more powerful." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. Conrad wasn't one for tall tales or exaggeration. In the 20 years I'd known him, I'd never seen him rattled like this. So I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and went to check on the deer. I was thinking maybe a bear was trying to get at it. He paused, looking down at his mug. "What did you see?" I prompted. "It was standing there right under my deer, tall, 7, maybe 8 feet, covered in dark hair, built like an ape, I guess, but standing upright, broad shoulders, long arms." I exchanged glances with Diego. Conrad caught it and frowned. "I'm not crazy, Frank, and I wasn't drunk. I know what I saw." "What happened next?" I asked, trying to keep my skepticism out of my voice. It turned and looked right at me. I had the flashlight on it, and its eyes. They reflected the light, like a dog's or cat's. Yellow. Then, before I could even think about raising my rifle, it reached up, grabbed the entire deer, guts, hide, rope and all, and took off into the woods. Conrad leaned forward. And here's the thing, Frank. My property line has a barbed wire fence about 50 yards from where I hang my game. This thing, it cleared that fence in one jump, just sailed right over with a whole deer in its arms. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to attribute this to an old man's imagination, maybe the play of shadows in the forest at night, but Conrad wasn't the type to make things up. "Did you go look for tracks this morning?" I asked, my rancher's practicality kicking in. "That's what I want to show you," he said, standing up. "Come on." We followed Conrad outside. His dogs refused to leave the porch, which was unusual. These were working dogs that followed Conrad everywhere. He led us around to the back of his cabin where the large oak stood. The rope he used for hanging deer was still tied to the branch, but it had been cleanly snapped about halfway down. "It didn't untie it or cut it," Conrad pointed out. "Just grabbed everything and ran." He then led us across his backfield toward the property line. As we approached the fence, I stopped in my tracks. About 20 feet of barbed wire fencing was completely torn down. Not cut, not carefully dismantled, torn down. The wooden posts were broken and splintered, and the wire was stretched and mangled. "Jesus," Diego muttered beside me. Conrad knelt by one of the damaged fence posts. "Look at this, Frank." I squatted next to him. There, caught on the barbs of the wire, were tufts of hair. I reached out and took some between my fingers. It wasn't bear hair. I know bear hair. This was coarser, longer, and darker. Not deer, not elk, not anything I recognized from the local wildlife. "You see," Conrad said quietly, "whatever this was, it's not something that's supposed to be here." I stood up, still holding the hair. "You report this to anyone? Fish and Wildlife, maybe?" Conrad shook his head firmly. "No, and I'm not going to. Last thing I need is government people tramping all over my property, asking questions, bringing media attention. You know how I feel about that." I did. Conrad valued his privacy above all else. It was why he lived so far from civilization. "Besides," he added, "who'd believe me? They'd think I was some crazy old man, or worse, they'd think I was poaching and making up stories to cover it." I pocketed the hair samples without really thinking about it. "Mind if we look around a bit more?" Conrad gestured for us to go ahead. Diego and I spent the next hour searching the area for tracks. The ground was hard in most places, but near the small creek that ran through Conrad's property, we found something. Large impressions in the mud, about 16 inches long. They weren't clear enough to make out toes or other details, but they were definitely bipedal and far too large to be human. "What do you think?" Diego asked me quietly, away from Conrad. "I don't know what to think," I admitted, "but that fence didn't tear itself down, and something left those tracks." We spent another hour helping Conrad repair the damaged section of fence as best we could with the materials he had on hand. None of us talked much. I could tell Diego was spooked, and frankly, so was I. Not because I was convinced it was Bigfoot or some monster, but because I couldn't come up with a logical explanation for what we were seeing. The ride home was tense and quiet. We left Conrad's place earlier than planned, wanting to make it back before dark. Neither of us particularly wanted to be in those woods after sunset anymore. A few days later, I sent those hair samples to a buddy who worked at a university lab in Sacramento. I told him I found them caught in my fence and was curious what animal they came from. He called me a week later, confused. "Where did you say you found these?" he asked. "Caught in my fence line." "Why?" "Well, they're hair fibers, all right, mammalian, but they don't match anything in our reference collection. The structure is similar to primate hair, but not from any species native to North America. Are you sure you found these on your property?" I thanked him and hung up, not knowing what else to say. That was 15 years ago. Conrad passed away about 5 years after that incident. Heart attack, they said. I still lease the same land, still run my cattle operation. I've spent hundreds more nights in those woods since then and never seen anything unusual myself. But things changed after that day. I carry a bigger caliber rifle now when I'm out checking fence lines. I don't stay out after dark if I can help it. And when I hear something moving through the brush in the evening, something heavy that snaps branches and doesn't move like a deer or bear, I remember Conrad's face that day and the fear in his eyes. I remember those tufts of hair that didn't belong to any animal that's supposed to be in these mountains, and I ride a little faster toward home. Story 11. I still can't shake what happened that night in October 2 years ago. I've told a few close friends, but most people give me that look. You know the one, like I'm either lying or crazy. My sister is the only one who truly understands because she was there with me. It was a Thursday night in October 2020, and we were driving through Apalachicola National Forest in the Florida Panhandle. My sister Laura had just broken up with her boyfriend and needed to get away for a few days, so I suggested a camping trip. We'd spent the day hiking and were heading to our campsite around 11 at night. That stretch of road through the forest is pitch black. No streetlights, no houses, nothing but trees and darkness. We hadn't seen another car for at least 20 minutes, and my headlights were the only thing cutting through the night. The radio was playing some country song Laura liked, and we were talking about nothing important. I remember needing to pee really badly. I'd been holding it for miles because there's literally nowhere to stop out there. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and pulled onto the shoulder. "I'll be right back," I told Laura, turning the car off but leaving the headlights on so I could see where I was going. "Seriously, here?" She sounded annoyed, but also nervous. "Can't you wait until we get to the campsite?" "It's still another 30 minutes, and I've been holding it for an hour," I said, already opening my door. "I'll just go right there by that tree. Keep an eye out for me." The forest was weirdly quiet that night. Usually you hear all sorts of noises, crickets, frogs, the rustling of small animals. But standing there by the roadside, I remember thinking how silent everything was. Just the occasional breeze moving through the pine trees. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm, even though the sky was clear with stars visible through the tree gaps. I walked maybe 15 feet from the car, just far enough to be out of the direct headlight beam, but still able to see. The ground was soft from rain earlier that day, and I remember the squish of pine needles under my boots. I was just finishing up when Laura knocked on the passenger window. I turned to look, and she was frantically gesturing for me to get back in the car. At first, I thought she was just being impatient, but then I saw her face. Her eyes were wide, and she was pointing toward the right side of the road, the side opposite from where I was standing. That's when I heard it. The sound of branches breaking, not small twigs, but the heavy crack of substantial limbs being pushed aside. Something big was moving through the forest toward us, and it was moving fast. The footsteps were heavy, purposeful, and getting louder by the second. I zipped up and started heading back to the car when the noise suddenly intensified. Whatever it was had broken through the underbrush and was now on the forest edge. That's when I saw it. I'll never forget the silhouette that emerged from between those trees. It was massive, standing upright on two legs, but definitely not human. The thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8, with shoulders twice as wide as mine. Even in the dim light, I could make out its hulking form moving with surprising speed directly toward our car. I've never moved so fast in my life. I sprinted those few yards back to the driver's side, fumbling with the door handle and practically diving inside. I slammed the door shut and hit the lock button, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the key to start the engine. "What the fuck is that?" Laura screamed, her face pressed against the passenger window. I cranked the engine and it roared to life, but not before I got a better look at what was approaching us. The headlights illuminated its lower half, thick, powerful legs covered in dark hair or fur, not like a bear but more like a gorilla, only darker. Brown or black, I couldn't tell exactly. What struck me most were its arms, unnaturally long, swinging with each stride, almost reaching its knees. Its head sat low between those massive shoulders, like it barely had a neck at all. I couldn't make out facial features clearly, but the overall shape was wrong for any animal I know. Not a bear, not a person in a suit. The proportions were all wrong. It moved with intent, with purpose, straight toward us. I jammed the car into drive and hit the gas, tires spinning on the loose gravel before catching. As we started to pull away, I instinctively tapped the brakes, a stupid reflex action that made the brake lights flash. In that brief red glow, I saw it standing in the middle of the road behind us, completely motionless, just watching us leave. Laura was half laughing, half crying, that weird reaction people have when they're terrified but don't know how else to process it. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I was pushing 80 on a forest road that should be taken at 40 max. Every curve felt like it might be our last if I lost control, but the thought of slowing down was worse than the risk of crashing. "Did you see that thing?" Laura kept saying over and over. "Jesus Christ, what was that?" "I don't know," was all I could manage. My mouth was so dry I could barely speak. We drove in silence for a while, both trying to make sense of what had happened. What bothered me most wasn't just what we'd seen, but how it had behaved. That thing came out of the woods at a full run, heading straight for our car, like it knew exactly what it was doing. No hesitation, no caution like you'd expect from a wild animal encountering humans. It came right for us with purpose. When we finally reached our campsite, neither of us wanted to get out of the car. We sat there with the doors locked for almost an hour, debating whether to leave altogether. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and we decided to stay, but slept in the car with the doors locked and windows up, despite the warm night. The next morning, everything looked different. The forest was alive with normal sounds. People at nearby campsites were going about their business, and what happened the night before almost seemed like a bad dream. Almost. We packed up early and left without saying much. On the drive home, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But bears don't run bipedally for extended periods, and the proportions were all wrong. A person in a costume, out in the middle of nowhere at 11 at night, sprinting toward random cars. It made no sense. I've spent countless hours researching since then. I've looked at every known animal in the Florida Panhandle. Nothing matches what we saw. The only thing that comes close are descriptions of Sasquatch or Bigfoot, the height, the body shape, the long arms. I was never a believer in that stuff before. I'm still not sure what I believe, but I know what I saw. The worst part is, I have to drive that road sometimes for work. Every time I pass that spot, my chest gets tight and my foot gets heavy on the accelerator. I can't help scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that figure emerge again. Laura refuses to go anywhere near Apalachicola now. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten back to the car in time. Whatever that thing was, it was coming for us specifically, not investigating out of curiosity, hunting us. I can still see it standing in the road behind us in that flash of brake light, watching us drive away. I've heard people say Florida isn't known for Bigfoot sightings like the Pacific Northwest, but there are old stories from the Seminole and Miccosukee about skunk apes and wild men in the swamps. Maybe there's something to those legends after all. Or maybe there's some unknown species out there that science hasn't documented yet. All I know for certain is that something was in those woods that night. Something big, something fast, and something that doesn't fit into any normal category of wildlife. Something that saw us and decided to approach with intent. The memory of those heavy footsteps coming through the brush still wakes me up at night sometimes. Laura and I have a pact now. We don't stop on forest roads after dark, for any reason, and we never drive through Apalachicola at night again. I still haven't found an explanation for what we saw. The image of that massive silhouette emerging from the trees is burned into my memory. The impossible width of its shoulders, the strange way its head sat between them, those arms swinging as it ran. Not like a human runs, but not like any animal either. Something in between. Whatever it was, it moved with purpose and intelligence. That's what scares me the most. It wasn't random. It saw us and made a decision. I just don't know what would have happened if it had reached us before we drove away. 2 years later, and I still check my rearview mirror whenever I'm driving on a dark road. Some nights I swear I can hear those heavy footsteps following me in my dreams. I don't know what we encountered that night, but I know it was real, and I know it's still out there in those woods waiting. Story 12. I've never shared this story online before, partly because I didn't think anyone would believe me, and partly because even now I get this cold feeling in my chest when I think about it. But I need to get this out somewhere, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I grew up in a really isolated spot outside Bogalusa, Louisiana. When I say isolated, I mean our nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away. And to reach our house, you had to drive down this winding dirt road that cut through dense pine and cypress forests. My parents bought the place when I was 8, and I'd grown up loving the isolation and the freedom it gave me. That all changed last April. It was a Wednesday evening, I remember, because my dad had come home early from work to help me fix the gate to our front yard that had been sagging for months. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across our field. There was this perfect calm in the air. You know that feeling right before a thunderstorm when everything gets really still? It was like that, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Dad and I were hammering the last nail into the repaired hinge when we heard it. I'll never forget that sound as long as I live. It wasn't a scream exactly. It was something more primal. It started low, then rose to this pitch that made my skin crawl, held for what felt like forever, then dropped again. It came from the tree line across our field, maybe 100 yards away. Dad and I both froze. The hammer in his hand stopped mid-swing. I remember looking at him and seeing his face change in a way I'd never seen before. He wasn't scared exactly. My dad isn't the type to show fear, but there was this alertness, this tension that came over him. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. He shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on the tree line. "Don't know," he muttered. "Could be a bobcat or..." Before he could finish, there was another scream. This one was similar, but from a slightly different position, maybe 20 yards to the left of the first. That's when I knew whatever made that sound had moved, and moved fast. Dad grabbed my arm. "Let's get inside." We hurried across the yard, leaving our tools scattered around the gate. As we approached the house, I saw Mom already standing at the window, her face pale. She'd heard it too. "What is that?" she asked as we came through the door. Dad locked it behind us, something we rarely did during daylight hours. "Not sure," he said, but I could tell he was lying. He had some idea, and whatever it wasn't good. Dad moved through the house, closing windows and drawing curtains. Without being told, I knew to turn off lights. It was instinctual somehow, like we all understood we didn't want whatever was out there to know we were home. As darkness fell completely, we sat in the living room. Dad had gotten his shotgun from the cabinet, a 12-gauge that had belonged to his father. He sat with it across his lap, staring at the front door. Mom and I sat on the couch, not speaking much, just listening to the sudden, heavy silence outside. Around 10 o'clock, I started to think maybe whatever it was had moved on. I was wrong. The screaming started again, but this time it came from behind our house, where the woods meet this shallow creek that runs through our property. It was louder now, more intense. The sound had these qualities that just weren't natural. It would rise and fall in pitch, but the volume suggested something with massive lungs. I've heard all sorts of animals, coyotes, bobcats, even a mountain lion once when we visited my uncle in Texas, but this was different. It had almost human qualities, but distorted, like something trying to mimic human sounds, but getting it wrong in the most disturbing way possible. Our goats started going crazy in their pen. We had 4 of them, kept them for milk and to help clear brush. Their bleating had this panicked quality I'd never heard before, not even when coyotes had come near in the past. Dad stood up, shotgun at the ready. "Stay away from the windows," he said quietly. That's when it happened. Something struck the back of our house with enough force that I felt the entire wall vibrate. It wasn't like a branch falling. It was deliberate, powerful, like something had slammed into our house with tremendous force. Mom let out a small gasp and covered her mouth. I felt my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "What the fuck was that?" I whispered. Dad didn't answer. He moved to the kitchen, positioning himself where he could see both the back door and the side door that led to our carport. For the next few hours, we sat in terrified silence, listening to what can only be described as something circling our house. There were heavy footsteps, deliberate and slow, moving around the perimeter. Branches would snap suddenly, and occasionally there was this deep, rumbling, breathing sound that seemed to come from just outside the walls. At one point, something scraped against the siding of the house. Not like an animal scratching. This was long, continuous strokes that ran from low to high. I remember thinking it must be reaching up, dragging something along our wall. Around 2 in the morning, Mum whispered that maybe we should call someone, but our landline was in the kitchen and cell service was non-existent out where we lived. Besides, who would we call? The sheriff's office was a good 30 minutes away, and what would we tell them? That something was walking around our house making weird noises? So we waited. The noises continued off and on until around 4 in the morning, when they seemed to move farther away, back toward the woods. The last thing I remember hearing was a final scream, fainter this time, deeper in the forest. None of us slept. We sat there, watching the darkness slowly give way to the grey light of dawn. Only when the sun was fully up did Dad finally stand, his joints cracking from sitting in the same position for hours. "I'm going to check outside," he said, gripping the shotgun. "You two stay here." Mom tried to protest, but he was already heading for the door. I followed him despite his instructions, keeping a few steps back. What we found still gives me nightmares. The back of our house had 5 long parallel gouges in the siding. They started at about waist height and ran upward to above the windows, a good 8 feet up. These weren't like bear claw marks, which tend to be jagged and grouped in 4s. These were straight, clean scratches, spaced about a hand's width apart, like something with massive fingers had dragged its hand up our wall. One of the posts on the goat pen was cracked, not broken all the way through, but split lengthwise like something had gripped it with incredible force. The goats themselves were huddled in the corner of the pen, still visibly shaking. But the thing that really got to me was the footprint. Near the edge of the trees, in a patch of damp soil, there was a single, enormous impression. It was shaped like a human foot, but impossibly large, at least 16 inches long and proportionally wide. The impression was deep too, suggesting whatever left it was incredibly heavy. Dad stared at that footprint for a long time without saying anything. I could see something in his eyes I'd never seen before, not just fear, but a kind of fundamental doubt, like the world he thought he understood had suddenly revealed itself to be something else entirely. "What do you think it was?" I finally asked. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Ethan. I really don't know. We never reported what happened. Who would believe us? A giant humanoid creature circling our house in the middle of the night. We'd be laughed out of town. But that night changed everything about how we live. We started securing the doors and windows before sunset every evening. Dad installed motion sensor lights all around the property. We moved the goats to a pen closer to the house and built a stronger enclosure for them. Most significantly, none of us spends time outside after dark anymore. It's an unspoken rule in our family now. When the sun starts to set, we're inside with the doors locked and the curtains drawn. Sometimes at night, I think I can hear that scream again, far off in the distance. Mom says it's just my imagination, but I've caught Dad listening too. His body tense, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond our windows. Whatever was out there that night, it hasn't come back to our house. But I know it's still out there in those woods. There's this silent understanding in our family now that the forest surrounding our home isn't really ours. It belongs to something else, something that allows us to live here as long as we respect certain boundaries. I don't know what to call what happened to us. A Bigfoot encounter, maybe. All I know is that something unnatural was outside our house that night. Something powerful enough to crack solid wood and leave marks higher than any human could reach. Something intelligent enough to deliberately circle us, to test our defenses, to let us know it was there. And sometimes, when I look out at those trees, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching us, waiting to see if we'll venture out after dark again. Story 13. I've never told this story online before. Heck, I've barely spoken about it with my own family outside the 4 of us who were there. But I'm getting older now, and I figured this might be the place where people won't immediately think I'm crazy or a liar. And trust me, I wish I was lying about what happened that morning in 1970. I was 12 years old, and my cousin Danny was 13. We'd been begging our dads to take us on a real hunting trip for years, not just the little day excursions to public land near home, where we rarely saw anything worth shooting at. That fall, they finally agreed we were old enough to go to the Upper Peninsula for deer season. For you folks who aren't from Michigan, the UP is basically wilderness. Especially back then. Miles and miles of dense forest with hardly any people. Delta County, where we went, was about as remote as you could get without crossing into Canada. My Uncle Jack had access to this tiny cabin through a buddy of his from the service. It was nothing fancy. Basically 4 walls, a wood stove, a couple of bunk beds and a table. No running water, no electricity. We had to use an outhouse that looked like it might collapse if you sneezed too hard. We drove up on a Friday afternoon in mid-November. The trip took forever, especially after we crossed the Mackinac Bridge and got onto those 2-lane highways. The last hour was on these winding dirt roads that seemed to go nowhere. By the time we arrived, it was already getting dark. We unpacked the station wagon, got the wood stove going, and heated up some canned stew for dinner. My dad and Uncle Jack had a couple beers while they went over maps of the area, marking spots where they thought we might have luck the next morning. Rise and shine at 4:30, boys, Uncle Jack told us. We need to be in position before the deer start moving. I remember having trouble sleeping that night. The cabin made all these creaking noises, and the wind howled through the trees. Plus, I was excited about the hunt. This was the real deal. My first chance to bring down a buck and prove I wasn't just a kid anymore. Danny kept kicking me from the top bunk, and I swear he was snoring loud enough to scare away every deer in a 10-mile radius. When Dad shook me awake, it felt like I'd only been asleep for minutes. The cabin was freezing. I could see my breath inside. Uncle Jack had the wood stove going again and was frying up some eggs and bacon on top of it. We ate quickly, dressed in our hunting gear, and loaded the rifles into the car. I had my .30-30 that had belonged to my grandfather. Danny had a similar one his dad had gotten him for his birthday. It was pitch black outside when we piled into Uncle Jack's old Ford Bronco. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the heater was struggling to keep up with the cold. The thermometer at the cabin had said 28 degrees, but it felt colder. We'll drive about 3 miles in and then split up, my dad explained. Me and Will can take the ridge overlooking that swampy area, and you and Danny can set up near the clearing we saw on the map. Uncle Jack drove slowly along this narrow dirt road. The Bronco's tires crunched over frozen mud and patches of early snow. We were maybe a mile from the cabin when Danny suddenly smacked the back of Uncle Jack's seat. "Dad, stop! I think I saw a bear over there." Uncle Jack hit the brakes, and we all turned to look where Danny was pointing. At first, I couldn't see anything through the darkness. "Where?" Uncle Jack asked, keeping the engine running. "In that ditch on the left. I just caught a glimpse of something big and dark moving." My dad reached up and flicked on the roof-mounted spotlight. Uncle Jack kept for spotting deer at night, which wasn't exactly legal, but that's another story. The powerful beam swept across the roadside and into a shallow drainage ditch about 30 yards ahead. That's when we saw it. At first, it did look like a bear. There was this massive dark shape down on all fours in the ditch. It was covered in thick, shaggy hair that looked black, or maybe dark brown in the spotlight. But something was off about it. The proportions weren't right for a bear. Its arms seemed too long, the shoulders too wide. Uncle Jack kept the Bronco creeping forward, the spotlight fixed on this thing. We got within maybe 20 yards of it when it suddenly reacted to the light, and that's when everything changed. The creature, because I don't know what else to call it, suddenly stood up on two legs. Not like a bear might stand momentarily, but fully upright, and it was tall, so damn tall, 7 feet at least, maybe 8. It turned toward our vehicle, and for a split second I swear it looked right at us. I couldn't make out its face clearly in the spotlight, but I could tell it had a massive head that sat directly on those wide shoulders with hardly any neck. Then it moved, not like a person moves, but with this fluid, powerful stride that covered ground faster than seemed possible. In 3 or 4 steps, it crossed the entire width of the road in front of our vehicle. Its arms swung at its sides, hands or paws nearly reaching its knees. The whole body was covered in that same dark hair, which seemed to shimmer slightly as it moved through the light, and then it was gone, vanishing into the thick forest on the other side of the road. Nobody in the Bronco said a word for what felt like forever. Uncle Jack had stopped the vehicle completely. The engine idled as we all stared at the spot where the thing had disappeared. Finally, Uncle Jack turned to my dad and, in this voice I'd never heard him use before, kind of shaky and quiet, he said, "Bill, what on God's earth did we just see?" My dad didn't answer right away. His face looked pale in the dim light of the dashboard. I remember noticing his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the thermos of coffee between the seats. "I don't know, Jack," he finally said, "but it sure as hell wasn't a bear." In the back seat, Danny and I exchanged looks. I was terrified, but also confused. Nothing in my 12 years of life had prepared me for seeing something like that. I'd read about Bigfoot in my dad's outdoor magazines, seen those blurry pictures, but I'd always assumed it was made-up stuff, like UFOs or the Loch Ness Monster. Now I wasn't so sure. "Should we go after it?" Danny asked, trying to sound brave but his voice cracking. Both our dads turned around so fast you'd think Danny had suggested we jump off a cliff. "Absolutely not," my dad said firmly. Uncle Jack put the Bronco in reverse and started backing up slowly. "We're going back to the cabin. Now." "But what about hunting?" I asked, disappointed despite my fear. "We just got here." "There's not going to be any hunting today," Uncle Jack said. He turned the vehicle around and started driving back toward the cabin faster than we'd come. When we got back, they made us go inside while they unloaded the rifles. I could hear them talking in low voices by the Bronco, but couldn't make out what they were saying. When they came in, Uncle Jack went straight to his duffel bag and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. He and my dad each had a shot, which was unusual for my dad especially. He rarely drank hard liquor and never in the morning. "All right, boys," my dad finally said, sitting down at the small wooden table. "We need to talk about what we just saw." Uncle Jack nodded. That wasn't normal, wasn't natural. "Was it a Bigfoot?" Danny asked directly. The adults exchanged looks. "I don't know what to call it," my dad said carefully. "But I know it wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, and sure as hell wasn't a man in a costume." "Listen to me!" Uncle Jack leaned forward, looking at Danny and me with dead seriousness. "When we go back home, we're not talking about this. Not to your friends, not to your teachers, not to anybody. You understand?" "Why not?" I asked. My dad sighed. because people will think you're crazy, Will, or that you're making it up for attention. They'll laugh at you. Your dad's right, Uncle Jack added. People who haven't seen something like this, they can't understand, and they won't believe you. We spent the rest of that day in the cabin. Nobody wanted to go outside more than necessary. Uncle Jack kept looking out the windows, and my dad checked to make sure his rifle was loaded and within reach. We played cards and tried to act normal, but there was this heavy tension in the air. Every sound from outside, branches snapping, wind gusting, made us all jump. That night I could barely sleep again, but for completely different reasons. I kept picturing that thing crossing the road, how fluid and powerful it moved, how impossibly large it was. I tried to convince myself that maybe it had just been a bear and my imagination had run wild, but I knew better. We all did. The next morning, Uncle Jack announced we were heading home early. We packed up without argument. On the drive back to the cabin's owner to drop off the keys, Uncle Jack and my dad concocted a story about Danny getting sick with some stomach bug, forcing us to cut the trip short. Nobody questioned it. The long drive home was mostly silent. Occasionally, one of us would say something like, "Those arms were so long," or "Did you see how fast it moved?" And the others would just nod. We were processing it in pieces, I think. Before we got back to our town, my dad pulled over at a rest stop. While Danny and I used the bathroom, I overheard my dad and uncle talking by the car. "We take this to our graves, Jack," my dad said. "Nobody would understand." And that's exactly what we did for the most part. For over 50 years now, this has been our family secret. Uncle Jack passed away 10 years ago. My dad's health isn't great. Danny and I are the only ones who still talk about it sometimes, usually after a few beers at family gatherings when we can find a private moment. I've read everything I could find about similar encounters over the years. Some descriptions match almost exactly what we saw. Sometimes I wonder how many other people are out there, keeping their own encounters secret out of fear of ridicule. I still hunt, but never alone, and never in the Upper Peninsula. Some places, I've come to believe, we're not meant to understand. Some things we're not meant to see. That morning in 1970 changed something fundamental in how I view the world and the woods. Every time I'm in a forest and hear something moving just out of sight, I wonder, is it watching me now, the way it watched us then? Story 14. I've never been a guy who shares personal stuff online, but after what happened to me in Kisatchie National Forest back in January of 2008, I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar, or maybe you'll just think I'm crazy. Either way, I haven't been the same since. I've been hunting since I was 12. My dad taught me everything I know. I'm experienced, level-headed, and not prone to exaggeration. What I saw that day wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, and sure as hell wasn't anything I've ever encountered in all my years in the woods. It was late January, almost the end of hunting season. Most hunters had already packed up and gone home, which was fine by me. I've always preferred the solitude of the woods when there aren't a bunch of weekend warriors tramping around scaring off all the game. The forecast called for clear skies, temperature in the high 20s, perfect hunting weather. I drove out to Kisatchie before dawn, arriving at my usual spot about half a mile from the main trail. There's this small clearing where I can park my truck, an old Ford F-150 that's seen better days, but has never let me down. I grabbed my .30-06 rifle, my day pack with some sandwiches, water and basic supplies, and headed deeper into the forest on foot while it was still dark. I found a good spot against a large oak tree with decent visibility of a game trail and settled in. The sun came up slowly, filtering through the bare branches overhead. I expected the usual morning chorus of birds and the rustling of small creatures, but something felt off from the start. The forest was dead quiet, like unnaturally quiet. No birds calling, no squirrels chattering, nothing, just complete silence. At first, I figured maybe another hunter had come through recently and spooked everything. But after 3 hours of sitting there without hearing so much as a leaf rustle, I started getting uneasy. Something wasn't right. Animals don't just disappear like that. Around noon, my legs were stiff and I hadn't seen a single deer, not even tracks. I decided to move, maybe explore up this shallow draw I knew had a small creek running through it. I packed up my small folding seat and started walking, moving slowly and quietly, like I always do. That's when I first felt it, the sensation of being watched. Every hunter knows that feeling, but this was different. It was intense, like whatever was watching me was fixated on my every move. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I got this cold feeling in my gut that had nothing to do with the January air. I stopped, listened, and scanned the trees around me. Nothing. I started walking again, and that's when I heard it, footsteps behind me. Not the light, quick steps of a deer or even the heavier tread of a bear. These were deliberate, powerful strides with a longer gait than mine, and they matched my pace perfectly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I walked, they walked. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I tried to tell myself it was just another hunter, but deep down I knew better. No hunter moves like that. I picked up my pace slightly, and the footsteps behind me did too. I stopped again, turned around slowly and called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" My voice sounded thin and scared, even to my own ears. Silence. Then a deep, drawn-out growl came from the brush about 20 yards to my right. It wasn't a bear growl. I've heard plenty of those. This was deeper, more guttural, almost like it was coming from something with a chest cavity twice the size of mine. It started low and built into something that made my insides turn to ice. I raised my rifle instinctively, pointing it toward the sound. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the stock tighter just to hold it steady. That's when I caught my first glimpse of it. Something tall and dark moving between the trees, just out of clear sight. Not walking on all fours like a bear, but upright. Tall, so damn tall. It moved behind a stand of pines and I lost sight of it. I stood frozen, unable to make myself run, unable to do anything but wait for it to show itself again. The forest was completely silent, except for my own ragged breathing. Then it stepped out from behind a large tree, about 40 yards away, and I swear to God, my brain just couldn't process what I was seeing. It stood at least 8 feet tall, and that's a conservative estimate. It was covered in dark brown hair, not fur, but hair like a human's, but thicker and shaggy. Its shoulders were massive, probably twice as wide as mine, with long, powerful arms that hung down past its knees. I stood there staring at it, and it stared right back at me. It wasn't just some animal. There was intelligence in the way it moved, the way it watched me. It knew exactly what I was, and it didn't like me being there. The creature moved behind a thicket, partially obscured but still visible. I could hear its breathing, rough and heavy, like someone who'd run a long distance. Then it did something I'll never forget as long as I live. It screamed. Not a howl, not a roar, but something that started as a rising howl and ended as a full-throated roar that echoed through the trees. It was so loud it felt like it was inside my head, vibrating through my bones. That's when my survival instinct finally kicked in. I turned and ran. I didn't think about it, didn't plan it, just ran like hell back toward where I'd parked my truck. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, branches snapping like toothpicks. I risked a glance back and saw it running on 2 legs, just like a person, but with this powerful, loping stride that was eating up the distance between us. It couldn't have been more than 30 yards behind me. I'm not ashamed to admit I screamed. Any man would have. Its face, I could see its face as it ran. It had less hair around the mouth and eyes, with dark, deep-set eyes under this heavy brow ridge. Its mouth was open as it roared again, showing teeth that weren't fangs, but wide, flat teeth with some pointed ones mixed in. There were thick strands of spit hanging from its lips. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like rubber, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I could hear it right behind me, this rhythmic pounding as its feet hit the ground. Each impact felt like it was shaking the earth. I broke through the trees into the clearing where my truck was parked and sprinted the last 50 yards. I fumbled with my keys, dropping them once before finally getting them into the ignition. The whole time I was expecting those massive hands to grab me through the window, to pull me out of the cab. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into drive, tires spinning in the dirt before catching. As I pulled away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw it standing at the edge of the clearing, its massive chest heaving as it watched me leave. It didn't follow onto the open ground, just stood there, like it knew it had successfully driven me out of its territory. I drove like a maniac back to the main road, hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the truck on the trail. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over and threw up on the side of the road. My entire body was trembling, cold sweat soaking through my clothes despite the freezing temperature. It's been 15 years since that day, and I still have nightmares about it. I still hunt, but never alone, and never in Kisatchie. I stick closer to home now, to areas I know well and that are more frequently traveled. I've told a few close friends what happened, but most just give me that look. You know the one, like they think I'm exaggerating or saw a bear standing on its hind legs. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. Whatever chased me through those woods that day was something science says doesn't exist. It was a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it, and it was hunting me just as surely as I'd been hunting deer. The thing that haunts me most isn't just how big it was or how fast it moved. It's the intelligence I saw in those eyes, the purpose, the absolute lack of fear. It wasn't scared of me or my rifle. It wanted me gone, and it made damn sure I left. I don't have proof. No photos, no footprints, nothing but my story. But I know what I experienced, and now, so do you. Believe me or don't, that's up to you. But if you're ever hunting alone in Kisatchie National Forest and the woods go silent, if you feel those eyes on you and hear those footsteps matching yours, don't wait around to see what's making them. Run. Run as fast as you can, because whatever's out there, it's real. And it doesn't want us in its woods. Story 15. I've been camping all my life, literally since I was a baby. My dad would take me and my brothers out to the woods every other weekend, rain or shine. I've seen bears rummaging through poorly secured food, had raccoons try to steal my backpack, and once even had a mountain lion stalk our campsite for nearly an hour before moving on. Nothing ever really scared me in the outdoors until April 19th, 2003. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night at Jones Valley Campground on Lake Shasta. I've tried to rationalize what happened a million different ways, but I still can't explain it. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't high, and I wasn't imagining things. My buddy Mark and I had planned this trip for weeks. We both needed to get away from work stress. And Lake Shasta in spring is beautiful, not too hot, not too cold, and usually not too crowded. We arrived around noon on Saturday, set up our small camper and a tent. I usually prefer sleeping outside when the weather's nice, and spent the day fishing and hiking. Nothing unusual happened during the day. We caught a few bass, had some beers, grilled burgers, typical camping stuff. What first struck me as weird was how empty the campground seemed for a Saturday in April. There were maybe 3 other groups camping in our loop, but they were pretty far from us. We had chosen a spot that backed up to a pretty dense section of forest, which I usually prefer for privacy. In hindsight, maybe not the best choice. By 10 that night, Mark had crashed in the camper. He'd had a few more beers than me and was out cold. I stayed up by the fire, just enjoying the quiet and watching the embers die down. That's when I first noticed something was off. It was too quiet. If you've ever spent time in the woods at night, you know they're never actually silent. There's always something. Crickets, frogs, the rustle of nocturnal animals, wind in the trees. But that night, It was like someone had hit the mute button on the whole forest. No insect sounds, no distant splashes from the lake, nothing, just dead silence. I remember checking my watch, exactly 10 p.m., and thinking how weird it was. I was poking at the dying fire with a stick when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a large tree branch snapping. Crack. It was loud and sharp, maybe 50 yards away in the trees behind our site. I didn't think much of it at first. Branches fall in forests all the time, right? Except I never heard the sound of anything hitting the ground afterward. Just that one sharp crack, then silence again. I sat there for another 10 minutes or so, feeling increasingly uneasy, though I couldn't exactly say why. Then another crack, identical to the first one. This time it was closer, maybe 40 yards away. Same sound, same abrupt end with no follow-up noises. That's when the hair on my arm stood up, because it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Something was moving toward our campsite, and whatever it was big enough to snap substantial branches. I stood up and peered into the darkness, but couldn't see anything past the dim glow of the dying fire. I grabbed my flashlight, but hesitated to shine it into the woods. Part of me didn't want to know what was out there. Then I heard them. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Not the scurrying of a small animal, or even the four-legged gait of a deer or bear. These were bipedal steps, with a rhythm that could only belong to something walking on two legs. I counted at least 10 distinct heavy footfalls moving in my direction. The steps stopped, and then, crack, a third branch snapped, this one close enough that I could almost feel the vibration, maybe 10 yards from where I was standing. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared shitless. Whatever was out there was huge. It was walking on two legs, and it was methodically approaching our campsite. I quickly went to the camper and shook Mark awake. "There's something outside," I whispered urgently. "Something big." Mark is a heavy sleeper, especially after drinking, but the panic in my voice must have cut through his beer-induced slumber. He sat up, confused but alert. "What'd you see?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "I didn't see anything," I told him. "But I heard it. It's walking on two legs, Mark, and it's big." We both froze as 3 or 4 more heavy footsteps sounded just beyond the edge of our campsite. Then, nothing. Complete silence again. Mark's face went pale. He'd heard it too. There was no mistaking those footsteps for anything normal. "Bear," he suggested weakly. I shook my head. "Bears don't walk like that, not for that distance. And the steps are too far apart. I've seen black bears stand on their hind legs plenty of times, but they don't walk that way for long distances, and the stride length was all wrong, too deliberate. Besides, black bears in California aren't that big." Mark decided to stay in the camper, can't blame him. I went back outside, armed with my flashlight and a hatchet we'd used to split kindling earlier. Call me crazy, but I needed to know what was out there. The campfire had died down to almost nothing by then, just a few glowing coals. I stood there for what felt like forever, scanning the tree line with my flashlight, listening so hard my ears hurt. Nothing, no movement, no sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually I backed slowly toward the camper, never turning my back to the forest. Once inside, I locked the door and sat by the window watching. Mark had fallen back asleep somehow, but there was no way I was closing my eyes. The rest of the night passed without incident. No more footsteps, no more cracking branches. But that silence remained, unnatural and suffocating, until dawn finally broke. In the morning light, I went to investigate. I'm not sure what I expected to find. Footprints maybe, broken branches, some sign of whatever had been stalking our campsite. But there was nothing obvious. The forest floor was too covered with pine needles and dried leaves to show tracks. I did find a few broken branches about the height, where I'd heard the snapping sounds, but nothing conclusive. We packed up and left earlier than planned. Neither of us wanted to spend another night there. On the drive home, Mark tried to rationalize what we'd heard. Maybe it was a deer. No way. Maybe a ranger patrolling the area. At that hour without a flashlight. Maybe just the woods settling. Woods don't take deliberate footsteps. I've been back to Lake Shasta many times since then, but never to Jones Valley campground. I can't bring myself to go back there. I've spent countless hours researching what it could have been. I've read about mountain lions, bears, elk. None of them fit what I experienced. I've even reluctantly looked into Bigfoot sightings in the area, though I've always considered myself too practical to believe in cryptids. But here's the thing that still haunts me. Whatever was in those woods that night was intelligent. The way it announced its presence with those snapping branches, moving closer each time. The way it approached directly, but stopped just short of showing itself. The way it seemed to create that unnatural silence. It wasn't random animal behavior. It felt calculated. I'm 47 years old now. I've spent my entire life in the outdoors. I know what bears sound like, what deer sound like, what people sound like moving through the woods. Whatever was at Jones Valley campground that night wasn't any of those things. I still camp regularly, still hike, still fish. But now, I always sleep with a larger flashlight and something more substantial than a hatchet. And whenever I'm in the woods and that unnatural silence falls, when the insects and frogs suddenly go quiet, I pack up and leave. Because something was stalking us that night at Lake Shasta. Something that wanted us to know it was there, and to this day I have no idea what it was. Story 16. I'm not really sure what made me wake up that morning. Something just felt off. It was the summer of 2003, and I was 11 years old. My brother Mike, 13 at the time, our friend Danny and I had been begging our parents to let us camp out by ourselves all summer. They finally caved, but only because the camping spot was literally just the field behind our house in the Fraser Valley, British Columbia. We weren't exactly roughing it. Our house was maybe a 2-minute walk away, and we could still see the back porch light from where we'd set up. But to us kids, it felt like a real adventure. We'd dragged out this old blue tarp, some sleeping bags, and a cooler full of sodas and snacks. No tent. We wanted to sleep under the stars. It was one of those perfect summer nights, warm enough that you didn't need much more than a light sleeping bag. The field backed up to this dense forest that had always kind of freaked me out, even in daylight. Not that I'd ever admit that to Mike or Danny. We'd set up about 20 feet from where the trees started, close enough to feel adventurous, but not so close that we couldn't make a quick dash back to the house if needed. I remember we stayed up way too late that night. We had a small battery-powered lantern, told stupid ghost stories, gorged ourselves on chips and candy, and eventually passed out sometime after midnight. Mike was snoring like a chainsaw within minutes. I woke up suddenly. The sky was starting to lighten, just barely. That weird pre-dawn time when everything's gray and quiet. Must have been around 4:30, maybe 5 in the morning. At first I thought maybe I needed to pee or that Mike's snoring had woken me up. But then I realized everything was silent. Too silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. That's when I felt it. This weird pressure in the air, like right before a thunderstorm, except there wasn't a cloud in the sky. I lay there in my sleeping bag, not moving, just listening. My heart was already starting to beat faster, though I didn't know why yet. Then I saw movement at the edge of the forest. Just a shadow at first, something shifting between the trees. I remember thinking maybe it was a bear or a deer. We saw them sometimes in our yard, but it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. This thing stepped out from between the trees and started walking along the tree line, walking upright, on 2 legs, like a person, but not a person at all. The first thing that hit me was how massive it was. I'm not exaggerating when I say it had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, and wide. Its shoulders were probably twice as broad as my dad's, and my dad was a big guy. It moved with this weird grace, though, not clumsy or lumbering like you'd expect something that size to move. The hair is what I noticed next. Dark, almost black, covering its entire body. Not matted or dirty like you'd expect from a wild animal. It looked almost well kept, clean anyway, shaggy but not tangled. The hair on its arms seemed slightly longer, and I could see the muscles underneath as they swung naturally at its sides. Its head sat low on those massive shoulders, not really a neck that I could see, and then it turned to look directly at me. And I swear, time just stopped. The eyes. God, the eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were intelligent, aware, focused, looking right at me with a clarity that made my blood run cold. Not because it seemed threatening, but because in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever this thing was, it was thinking, considering, watching me watch it. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think about screaming. Mike and Danny were still sound asleep beside me, and part of me wanted desperately to wake them up so they could see it too, so I wouldn't be the only one. But another part, the part that was locked in that stare, knew somehow that I shouldn't. That this moment was, I don't know, private almost. It just kept walking, never breaking eye contact with me. Its head swiveled smoothly to maintain that gaze as it moved, like it didn't want to look away any more than I could. There was no aggression in its posture, no sign it was going to charge or attack, just this calm, deliberate walk along the edge of the trees. The whole thing probably lasted 15 seconds max, but it felt like forever. Then, without any hurry, it turned its head forward again and continued walking until it disappeared back into the forest. I lay there frozen solid for what felt like hours, but was probably just minutes. My heart was pounding so hard, I was surprised it didn't wake up Mike or Danny. I kept expecting it to come back, to maybe come closer this time. But it didn't. When I finally got the courage to move, I just curled deeper into my sleeping bag and stared at the tree line until the sun came up fully. I didn't sleep another minute. When Mike and Danny woke up, I didn't tell them. I don't really know why. Maybe because I was scared they wouldn't believe me. Maybe because I was scared they would. Or maybe because that moment, that locked gaze, felt so intense and personal that talking about it would somehow cheapen it. We packed up our stuff that morning and headed back to the house. Mom made pancakes, and everything was normal. Except I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes. I tried to find logical explanations. Maybe it was just a really tall person in some kind of costume. But the way it moved, so natural and fluid, no costume could capture that. A bear standing on its hind legs? No way. This thing was walking comfortably upright, not struggling for balance. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear anyway. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep well. I kept thinking about it, kept seeing those eyes when I closed my own. I started researching at the library, looking through books about local wildlife. Nothing matched what I'd seen. Then one day, I overheard my dad talking to our neighbor about something strange. Someone had spotted up near Sasquatch Provincial Park. Yeah, ironic name, I know. They were laughing it off, but I remember my stomach doing this weird flip. I started reading everything I could find about Bigfoot, Sasquatch sightings in the Fraser Valley. Some of the descriptions matched what I'd seen, but most sounded exaggerated or fake. None of them talked about the eyes the way I'd experienced them. I became obsessed with the forest behind our house. I'd stand at my bedroom window for hours, staring at the tree line, hoping to catch another glimpse. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, shadows shifting between trees, but nothing definitive. Nothing like that morning. A few times that summer, I tried to convince Mike and Danny to camp out there again, but by then, they'd lost interest in sleeping on the hard ground when perfectly good beds were available inside. And honestly, I was too scared to go alone, though I desperately wanted to see it again. The strange thing is, I wasn't afraid of being hurt. That creature, whatever it was, could have easily attacked us if it wanted to. 3 kids sleeping unprotected would have been easy targets, but there was nothing threatening in its demeanor. Just curiosity, maybe. Recognition of some kind. As the years passed, the memory never faded like childhood memories usually do. Most things from when I was 11 are hazy at best now, but that morning remains crystal clear. Those 15 seconds are burned into my brain with perfect clarity. I'm 31 now. I've never told anyone about this until writing it out here. Not my family, not my friends, not even my wife. I've come close a few times, but the words always get stuck. How do you explain something like that without sounding crazy? How do you describe the way it felt to lock eyes with something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably does? I moved away from the Fraser Valley after college, but I go back to visit my parents a couple times a year. Every time I find myself staring at that forest line, wondering, I've never camped out there again, though I've thought about it. Part of me is desperate to experience that moment again, to confirm that it really happened the way I remember it. Another part is terrified that it did. What haunts me most isn't the size of the creature or the impossibility of its existence. It's those eyes, the absolute certainty I felt that I was being seen, truly seen, by something with a mind working behind those eyes, something that recognized me as another thinking being. Something that chose to observe rather than confront. Sometimes I wonder if it tells stories about me too, the small, hairless creature it saw sleeping under the stars one summer morning, who woke up at the wrong moment and locked eyes with something from another world, not the world of fantasy or nightmare, but a world that exists alongside ours, just out of sight for most people, most of the time. I've never seen it again, but I know it's out there. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I get that same feeling, that pressure in the air, that unnatural silence, and I know I'm being watched by those same intelligent eyes, considering me just as I once considered it. That brief connection across species, across understanding, 15 seconds that changed how I see the world forever. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Most days, I'm not sure I believe it myself. But then I remember those eyes and I know. Duh. Story 17. I'm still not sure what we saw that day. It's been over 50 years, but the memory has never faded. I was just 10 years old, in the summer of 1869, living with my family on our small property near Braidwood in New South Wales. Our homestead wasn't much, but to us children it was paradise. Endless bushland to explore, creeks to splash in, and hidden places only we knew about. There were 5 of us summer children then. I was the middle child, with my older brothers William and Thomas, 12 and 14, and my younger sisters Elizabeth and Mary, 8 and 6. Our father worked the land, and Mother kept the house and tended to our small vegetable garden. It wasn't an easy life, but it was ours, and we were happy. That day began like any other. The morning air was already warm, with the promise of a scorching afternoon, as Mother sent us out to play while she did the washing. Father had gone to town for supplies and wouldn't be back until evening. Stay within calling distance, she warned, as always. But children being children, we wandered further than we should have. We were heading toward our favorite spot, a small clearing near the creek about half a mile from the house. William had built a crude lean-to there from fallen branches, and we'd pretend it was our own home. The bush was thick around our property, with tall eucalyptus trees creating dappled shadows on the ground. The scent of the gum trees hung heavy in the air, mingling with the earthy smell of the soil. William was leading as usual, with Thomas right behind him. I was keeping an eye on the girls, making sure they didn't fall behind. Elizabeth was chattering away about something or other, while little Mary was stopping every few steps to pick up interesting stones and leaves. "Hurry up," William called back to us. "I want to fix the roof before it gets too hot." We weren't far from the clearing when Thomas suddenly stopped, causing me to bump into him. "What's wrong?" I asked, annoyed. He put his finger to his lips. "Listen." We all fell silent. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of a kookaburra. Then I noticed what Thomas had detected. The bush had gone strangely quiet, The constant background chatter of birds had ceased, and even the insects seemed to have fallen silent. "Something's not right," William whispered, his earlier impatience forgotten. That's when we heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like something large moving through the underbrush. It wasn't the familiar sound of a kangaroo or wallaby. This was different, more deliberate somehow. "Is it a dingo?" Elizabeth whispered, grabbing my hand. I shook my head. We all knew dingoes didn't make that kind of noise. William, always the brave one, took a few steps toward the sound. "Hello?" he called out, his voice breaking slightly. "Is someone there?" The shuffling stopped. For a long moment, everything was perfectly still. Then the bushes about 20 yards ahead of us parted, and it stepped out into a patch of sunlight. I'll never forget my first glimpse of the creature. It was upright, like a human, but there was nothing human about it. It stood about as tall as Thomas, maybe 5 feet or a bit more, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging almost to its knees. Its legs looked somewhat human, but ended in the most enormous feet I'd ever seen, easily 1.5 feet long, with strange, elongated toes that splayed out on the ground. The thing was covered in coarse black hair, not fur like an animal, but more like human hair, only everywhere except its face and feet. A strange tan-colored streak ran from its neck down to its belly, standing out against the black. Its muscles were clearly visible beneath the hair, especially across its chest and shoulders, but it was the face that haunts me still. It protruded forward in a way I can't properly describe, not quite like an ape, but certainly not human. The back of its head was oddly flat, as if it had been pressed against a board as a baby, and its eyes... God help me, its eyes were dark and intelligent, taking us in with a look that was far too knowing. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. 5 terrified children and this impossible creature. It made no sound, just watched us with those unnervingly aware eyes. Mary was the first to react. She let out a high, thin scream that seemed to break the spell. The creature flinched at the sound, and in that instant, William shouted, "Run!" We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and ran as fast as our legs would carry us, back toward home. I grabbed Mary's hand, practically dragging her along. I could hear Elizabeth sobbing as she ran, and the boys crashing through the bush ahead of us. I couldn't help myself. I looked back over my shoulder. The creature was following us, moving with a strange loping gait that ate up the distance between us with frightening speed. Those massive feet seemed to barely touch the ground as it ran. "It's coming!" I screamed, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. William and Thomas stopped and turned. "Keep going!" William shouted to me and the girls. "Get to the house!" Then my brave brothers began picking up rocks and sticks, preparing to defend us. I hesitated, torn between following orders and staying with my brothers. Thomas saw my indecision and yelled, "Go!" I turned and pulled the girls along, their small legs struggling to keep up. I could hear the boys behind us, shouting and throwing their missiles at the creature. Then came a sound that froze my blood. A high, strange cry that was neither animal nor human, followed by my brother's footsteps racing to catch up with us. "It's still coming!" Thomas gasped as he reached us. Our house came into view, and I've never been so glad to see our humble dwelling. Mother was hanging washing on the line, her back to us. She turned at the sound of our approach, her expression changing from surprise to alarm as she took in our terrified faces. "Inside, all of you, inside now!" she commanded, instantly alert to danger, though she couldn't yet see what was pursuing us. We burst through the door, all talking at once, trying to explain what we'd seen. Mother shushed us, quickly barring the door and checking that all the windows were secured. Father had installed sturdy shutters the previous year after a series of break-ins at neighboring properties, and now Mother closed and latched them all, plunging the house into semi-darkness. "What is it? Bush rangers?" she asked, reaching for Father's shotgun that hung above the fireplace. "No, Mother," William said, his voice still shaking. I don't know what it is. Some kind of creature. A monster, little Mary sobbed. Mother looked skeptical but kept the gun ready. Tell me exactly what you saw, she said firmly. We all started talking again until she held up her hand for silence. Thomas, you're the eldest here. Tell me calmly what you saw. Thomas took a deep breath. It was like a boy, but not a boy. About my size, but covered in black hair. It had a tan streak down its front. Its arms were too long, and its feet... He shook his head in disbelief. Its feet were enormous, Mother, bigger than Father's, with long toes. It had a flat head, Elizabeth added, making a chopping motion at the back of her own head. Like this. Mother's expression was hard to read. She went to the window and carefully peered through a crack in the shutters. I don't see anything, she said after a moment. Just then, we heard it. A soft thump against the side of the house, as if something had brushed against it. Mother raised the shotgun, pointing it at the door. Stay back, she whispered to us. We huddled together in the corner furthest from the door and windows. The house had never felt so small or so vulnerable. Another thump, this time at the back of the house, then another and another. It was circling us. A scratching sound came from the window nearest me, and I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. It was testing our defenses, looking for a way in. For over an hour, it continued this way, circling, scratching, occasionally thumping against the walls. We remained frozen in our corner, Mother standing guard with the shotgun. The girls were crying softly, and even the boys looked close to tears. I just felt numb with terror. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. We waited in tense silence, but nothing more happened. After what seemed like an eternity, Mother cautiously approached the window again. I think it's gone, she said, though she didn't sound convinced. We stayed inside until Father returned at dusk. Mother met him outside, and we watched through the window as she spoke to him urgently, gesturing toward the bush. Father's face grew serious as he listened. He came inside and questioned us all again about what we'd seen. Could it have been an aboriginal? He asked finally. We all shook our heads. We knew the local aboriginal people. This was something else entirely. Perhaps a deformed swagman, Mother suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Father took his gun and went out to search the property, but returned at dark, having found nothing except some unusual tracks near the creek. Too big for a man, he admitted reluctantly, and shaped all wrong. He reinforced the doors and windows that night, and for weeks afterward, we children weren't allowed to play beyond the immediate vicinity of the house. Father spoke with neighbors, but none had seen anything unusual. Eventually, life returned to normal, though we never again ventured to our special clearing by the creek. I've thought about that day countless times over the years. I've read about yowies and other bush creatures in the papers, wondering if that's what we encountered. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just a deformed person or a trick of light and shadow on some ordinary animal. But then I remember those intelligent eyes, those impossibly long arms, those enormous feet, and I know it was something else, something that shouldn't exist in our rational world. My brothers and sisters rarely speak of it now. It's as if we've made an unspoken agreement to leave that memory buried in the past. But I know they remember. Sometimes, when we're all together at Christmas and the conversation lulls, I'll catch Thomas staring into the distance or notice how William still positions himself near doors and windows, as if ready to run at any moment. Whatever it was we saw that day in the summer of 1869, it changed us forever. And sometimes, even now, when I'm alone in my house at night and the wind rustles through the trees outside, I find myself checking that the doors are locked, half expecting to hear that soft, deliberate shuffling approaching through the darkness. Story 18 happened that night at Watum Lake. I've always been the skeptical type, the one who rolls my eyes at ghost stories and cryptid sightings. But something happened that completely changed my perspective, and I need to get it off my chest. It was the summer of 2020. COVID was in full swing, and my girlfriend Amber and I were desperate to get out of our apartment after being cooped up for months. We decided camping would be the safest getaway, so we planned a 3-day trip to Watum Lake in Oregon. I'd been there a few times before. It's this beautiful spot nestled in the mountains with crystal clear water and plenty of secluded camping areas. We arrived at the lake around 4 in the afternoon. The main campground was pretty crowded, which wasn't what we wanted given the whole pandemic situation. Luckily, I knew that on the opposite side of the lake, there were a few unofficial camping spots where you could set up if you were willing to hike in a bit. So we parked at the day use area, loaded up our gear, and hiked about 30 minutes around the lake until we found the perfect spot. Our campsite was maybe 100 yards from the shore, in a small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. As we were setting up our tent, we noticed another group about a quarter-mile away. A bunch of teenagers, probably 6 or 7 of them. They were being loud, playing music and laughing, which was annoying but not unexpected. I figured they'd quiet down once it got late. After setting up camp, we cooked dinner on our portable stove, just some freeze-dried camping meals and hot chocolate. We washed our dishes in the lake and left them in about an inch of water near the shore to soak overnight. It was something I always did while camping, saved water and made cleanup easier the next day. As night fell, we sat by our small fire and watched the stars come out. The teenagers were still making noise, their voices carrying across the lake in the still air. Around 11, we decided to turn in. Our tent was small, just big enough for 2 sleeping bags and our backpacks. I remember thinking how peaceful it was once we were inside, listening to the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore and the occasional hoot of an owl. The teenagers finally quieted down around midnight. I remember checking my watch before I dozed off, feeling relieved that they'd finally shut up. Amber fell asleep almost immediately, but I lay awake for a while, just listening to the sounds of the forest. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, I was wide awake and my heart was pounding. Something had woken me up. I checked my watch. It was 2:17 in the morning. At first, I thought maybe it was just the wind or an animal moving through the underbrush. But then I felt it. A vibration. Not like an earthquake, but a rhythmic trembling in the ground. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy footfalls, moving slowly but deliberately through the forest. I've been camping my entire life, and I know what deer sound like. I know what bears sound like. This was different. Each step made the ground beneath our tent tremble slightly. Whatever was making those footsteps was massive, and it was getting closer. I lay there frozen, not daring to move or even breathe too loudly. Amber was still asleep beside me, her breathing deep and regular. I didn't want to wake her and possibly cause her to make noise. The footsteps continued to approach our campsite, and I could tell they were bipedal. 2 legs, not 4. The rhythm was all wrong for a quadruped. As the footsteps got closer to our tent, something strange happened. They suddenly became much lighter, as if whatever was making them had changed how it was walking. Instead of the heavy thuds that shook the ground, they became soft, careful steps, like something very large trying to move stealthily. I could hear it circling our tent now, moving with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. It paused near the entrance, and I swear I could hear breathing, deep, heavy breaths that didn't sound human. I was terrified it would open our tent, or worse, tear through it. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, it moved away from the tent and toward the lake. I heard the soft splash of water and then the sound of our dishes being disturbed. I remembered with a sinking feeling that we'd left them soaking at the edge of the lake. Whatever this thing was, it was investigating our stuff. I desperately wanted to peek outside, to see what was out there, but I was too scared to move. The rational part of my brain was saying it was probably just a curious bear, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. Bears don't walk on two legs for extended periods, and they don't sneak. After a few minutes of rummaging by the lake, the footsteps started again. This time, they were moving away from our campsite, back toward the forest. As the creature got further from our tent, the footsteps became heavy again. Thud, 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 each one shaking the ground. It was heading in the direction of the teenagers' camp. I lay there in the darkness, straining my ears to track its progress. The footsteps faded as it got further away, but I could still feel the occasional tremor in the ground when it took a particularly heavy step. Then, maybe 5 or 10 minutes after it left our campsite, I heard it, a scream, high-pitched and terrified, definitely a girl. It was cut short, like someone had slapped a hand over her mouth. Then a man's voice yelling something I couldn't make out. More shouting followed, and the sound of people running. I shook Amber awake, my hand over her mouth to keep her quiet. Her eyes flew open, confused and alarmed. "Listen," I whispered, so quietly I could barely hear myself. "Something's out there, something big. It was just at our camp, and now it's over at the other campsite. I think those kids are in trouble." She lay still, listening to the commotion in the distance. The shouting had died down, but we could hear movement, the sound of gear being hastily packed up, hushed, urgent voices. "Should we go help them?" she whispered back. I shook my head. "I don't know what's out there, but it's between us and them. If they're packing up to leave, they're probably okay. We need to stay quiet and not draw attention to ourselves." We stayed awake for the rest of the night, huddled together in our sleeping bags, listening. We heard the teenagers leave, their hurried footsteps fading into the distance. After they left, the forest became eerily quiet. No owls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just complete silence, like everything was holding its breath. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the trees, I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and peek outside. The campsite looked exactly as we'd left it, except for our dishes, which had been moved from the spot where we left them soaking. They weren't just shifted around, they were stacked neatly on a rock about 10 feet from the water's edge. Amber wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but I was too curious about what had happened at the other campsite. I told her to start packing while I went to investigate. She didn't want me to go alone, but I promised I'd be quick and stay in sight of our camp. I made my way carefully through the trees toward where the teenagers had been camped. What I found sent chills down my spine. Their campsite looked like it had been abandoned in a panic. A tent was still partially standing, with one of the poles snapped. Sleeping bags and personal items were scattered around, some half stuffed into backpacks. An expensive-looking Bluetooth speaker lay broken on a rock. There was a pot of what looked like pasta still on a camp stove, cold and congealed. But what really disturbed me was the footprints. The ground around their campsite was softer than ours, and I could clearly see large, bare footprints, much larger than any human foot I'd ever seen. They were deeply pressed into the dirt, as if made by something incredibly heavy, and they were definitely bipedal. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I hurried back to our camp, where Amber had already taken down the tent and packed most of our gear. We left within 20 minutes, not even bothering to eat breakfast. The hike back around the lake felt like it took forever, both of us constantly looking over our shoulders and jumping at every sound. When we got back to the parking lot, I noticed the teenagers' cars were gone. There was no sign of them, and no rangers or authorities around. Part of me wanted to report what had happened, but what would I say? That I heard footsteps and found some abandoned camping gear, that I saw footprints that looked too big to be human? I'd sound crazy. I've had plenty of wildlife encounters before. 3 years ago, I was camping alone at Green Lake in the Three Sisters Wilderness when a herd of elk wandered through my campsite while I was sleeping. I woke up surrounded by them, and it was startling but not frightening. I've had bears investigate my camp, deer walk right up to my tent, even a mountain lion that watched me from a distance once. This was different. Whatever visited our camp that night was walking on two legs. It moved with purpose and intelligence. It investigated our camp, touched our things, and then moved on to the next group of people. It wasn't just wandering through, it was checking us out. I've spent a lot of time trying to rationalize what happened. Could it have been a person? Maybe. But who could be heavy enough to make the ground shake with each step? And why would they be wandering around in the middle of the night, barefoot, scaring campers? The only explanation that makes any sense, as crazy as it sounds, is that it was a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I was the last person who would ever buy into Bigfoot stories. But after that night, I'm not so sure anymore. I still go camping, but never again at Watum Lake, and I always make sure we're not the only people around. Sometimes at night, I still wake up thinking I can feel those footsteps approaching, the ground trembling beneath me, and I wonder about those teenagers, what they saw that made them scream and flee in the middle of the night. Whatever it was, I'm grateful it decided to leave us alone.